Chapter 3747. When Yuan stayed quiet until dawn. She didn't even close her eyes, because she was afraid that if she closed her eyes, she would be vulnerable again and sink into depravity again. Just like that, it was dawn, and the morning light shone through the white curtains. Her eyes were a little sore and a little bitter. She gently blinked in his arms. Yimubai was still hugging her from behind. She gently struggled to get up, but when she was getting dressed, she couldn't help but turn her head to look at him. He was very good-looking. Even though he was in his 30s, he still had the most perfect appearance, and his body was well-maintained. When Yuan looked at him silently for a long time, then pushed the door open and went out. She made breakfast and then woke up Xiangnan. Xiangnan had already signed up for school and had to be at school before 8 o'clock. She woke her son up, took care of his clothes and food, and then sent him to kindergarten. She also asked for leave from school. After everything was done, she returned to the apartment. Yimubai was already up. He was wearing denim trousers, and his upper body was bare, revealing his muscular body. When he saw her come back, he frowned. "Where's Xiangnan?" Wen Yuan slowly closed the door and then looked down. "I signed him up for kindergarten. He's been at school for 2 days. She paused, as if she was afraid that he would object. "He's very obedient, and he's doing very well in school." Yimubai looked at her and then frowned. "Do you have any men's shirts here?" After asking, he also felt that it was a waste of time. How could she have any? Wen Yuan knew that he didn't like the smell of his shirt, so she said softly, "I'll wash it for you and dry it." When she said it, it was natural, and she didn't think much about it and went to the room. He grabbed her hand, still frowning. "What is this?" Wen Yuan stopped in his tracks and lowered his eyes. "Or I can help you buy it." "No need." His voice was indifferent, and then he let go of her. Wen Yuan went to the bedroom, took his shirt, washed it by hand, and then dried it. Yimubai leaned against the door of the bathroom and looked at her, watching her submissive appearance. Wen Yuan was very good-looking. His eyebrows and eyes were the type that would suit a home, especially his side profile, which was very good-looking. She was very focused when she was doing something, and he kept staring at her. After a long time, his voice was indifferent. "Wen Yuan, what's your decision?" She lowered her eyes, her long eyelashes fluttering. She turned back to glance at him before lowering her eyes again, her voice very soft. "I want to live in H City." He crossed his arms in front of him and looked at her quietly. "You mean you want to take care of Xiangnan alone?" "Yes." She pursed her lips. "I want to be alone." She spoke again. "Life in America is not suitable for me." He walked in and hooked his arm around her waist from behind. His strength was a little rough. He turned her around and pinched her chin with his other hand. His eyes searched for any changes in her expression. "Then why did you go to the United States before?" She didn't know what to do under his grip. She licked her lips. "That was then, and now is now, Yimubai. My feelings then and now are different." At that time, she still had feelings for him. But ever since that time in the hospital, she felt that it was impossible for them to be together again. She didn't want to be that humble anymore. "Is that so?" He narrowed his eyes. "It's good that you've decided." After that, he didn't talk to her anymore. He let her go and walked to the balcony of the bedroom to smoke. This book came from Chapter 3748. When Yuan continued to dry his clothes, she just turned her head and glanced at his back. Sexy and tall. She didn't dare to look at him anymore, and turned her head back in a panic. His proposal was actually a tempting poison to her. She used to be unable to resist it. Wen Yuan silently tried to ignore the impact of his body on her, and she didn't want to think about the things they used to have. Yimubai turned around while smoking, and leaned against the window to watch her. She was well-dressed, and only he knew how much her body made men want to vomit blood when she took off her clothes. His eyes swept over her. After a long time, she took out a shirt and walked towards him. "Okay, you can change." Yimubai took the shirt with the cigarette in one hand and looked at her deeply. Wen Yuan habitually looked down and was about to leave when he grabbed her hand. "This is the last time I'm asking you." His voice sounded a little low in the quiet space. "I have a career in New York. I can't appear in front of you again and again. I have my own life, and I won't change myself for a woman. Accepting you and Xiangnan is my biggest concession. If you want me to stay in H City with you, don't even think about it. Wen Yuan gently broke away from his hand. I didn't think that way. She looked up at him bravely. I don't dare to think that you'll give up anything for me or Xiangnan. Yi Mubai, Xiangnan was just an accident. You don't have to take it to heart. I can sign the agreement if you want, but I don't want your money. If you don't want my money, why do you want Yi Mulan's? His gaze was a little threatening. Wen Yuan bit her lip and looked down. After a long time she smiled. For me he's my family, and you really actually have nothing to do with him. She took a deep breath. It's just a dream that I pursued when I was young. When you were young. Yi Mubai sneered. Wen Yuan, you followed me when you were 30 and begged me to sleep with you. Have you forgotten? Her face was pale. She looked away. Don't say it anymore. Why not? Is it because you can't bear to look back? He let go of her with a sneer and put on his shirt. Then he dialed a number and asked his assistant to call a lawyer. In less than an hour, the lawyer came and the agreement was magically printed. Wen Yuan and Yi Mubai sat on 2 sofas in the small study. Yi Mubai looked at it for a while and then gave it to Wen Yuan. Wen Yuan reached out and took it. In fact, the agreement was very simple. It wasn't as complicated as that of divorced couples. It was mainly focused on Xiangnan's custody and visitation. It was written that if she remarried, Xiangnan's custody would be given to him. If Yi Xiannan stayed with him, he would pay her 20 million every year until Yi Xiannan turned 18. Yi. And at. Yi got it Yi. At 1. Yi, do you want to file a lawsuit now? He stared at her. Make a big fuss. Tell people that the child is not my brother's, but that you slept with me. Wen Yuan's face was even worse. Her lips were trembling. After a long time she said softly, Yi Mubai, you are too shameless. Update at night, this book came from. Chapter 3749. Are you shameless? He grabbed her wrist and raised it high. Who was the one who got pregnant with my child and played me like a fool? Wen Yuan, if you hadn't slept with me in the end, perhaps we wouldn't be like this now. But when you left, you still wanted to sleep with me. And then you told me that you had no feelings for me, that I was just a dream, and that there was no meaning to it. Don't you think that you are very selfish? He didn't even know what he was saying anymore. He was just angry. Later on, when Yi Mubai thought about the day and night, he realized that he was so angry because he liked Wen Yuan. He was angry because she had given up on him. Just when he fell in love with her, she had given up on him. But at this moment, he only felt that she was despicable, even speaking without thinking in front of the lawyer. Wen Yuan's face was very ugly and very pale. She sat there and stared at him blankly. It was as if she didn't know him. There was an indescribable hurt in her eyes. At this moment, Wen Yuan was extremely fragile. She didn't even know why she was so disgusted by him. Everything she did was wrong, and he hated her. In his heart, she was a very, very scheming woman. Since that was the case, why did he still marry her? Wasn't it better to find someone he liked? Wen Yuan hugged herself. She wasn't a weak person, but at this moment, she was hurt by him. She hugged herself and lowered her eyes, not looking at him anymore. Then she said softly, Yi Mubai, I agree. After saying that, she was a little dazed. She knew that her decision was destined to be lonely for the rest of her life. Other than Xiangnan, she would have nothing. She would never have feelings or a man again. But she felt that for Xiangnan, she was willing to sign this. Where do I sign? Her voice was a little shaky, and she had been trying hard to control herself. The lawyer was very uncomfortable at the side. It wasn't going to be easy to earn money today. He took the document over and pointed to a place for Wen Yuan to sign. Wen Yuan didn't even look at it and quickly signed. She used a lot of force, and the strength of the pen seeped into the paper, leaving a heavy mark there. After signing, she stared at it blankly, then looked up at Yi Mubai. I hope you won't regret it, he said to her. After he finished speaking, he walked out. Wen Yuan's calm voice came from behind him. I won't. Is that so? He stopped, turned his head, and gave her a mocking smile. Yi Mubai left, and so did the lawyer. When Yuan sat alone in the living room, the entire world was silent. She was wrong from the beginning. She wouldn't regret it, because she had to grow up and pay for her mistakes. Even if she was Wen Yuan, she thought that he would go back to America or be city directly. But when she went to pick up Xiangnan from kindergarten in the afternoon, the teacher said that Xiangnan had been picked up by his father. Wen Yuan's mind was in a mess. When she picked up her phone and dialed his number, she felt weak all over. The call went through, and Yi Mubai's voice was very cold. I'm picking up Xiangnan for lunch, and I'll send him back around 8 o'clock. He added, Don't worry, Miss Wen. I'm very contractual. Wen Yuan held the phone, and felt that his voice seemed to be coming from a very far place. When he opened his mouth, his voice was extremely hoarse. Thank you. End of this chapter. Chapter 3750. You don't need to thank me. I'm Xiangnan's father. Yi Mubai said coldly. Even if I want to give him a complete family. The phone in Wen Yuan's hand slipped. When she came back to her senses and picked it up, her face was already full of tears. She didn't know what was wrong with her. She just felt very, very uncomfortable. If there was anything in her life that she regretted the most, it would be the seduction that afternoon. She shouldn't have slept with him for the last time just to say goodbye. She didn't understand why he would have such a big reaction to sex in the past. Was it because of Xiangnan's existence? She didn't understand. She didn't want to understand anymore. To understand a person meant that she wouldn't give up. And she really wanted to give up on him. On the other side, Yi Mubai hung up the phone. He held the steering wheel with both hands and focused on driving. Yi Xiangnan sat in the back seat and looked at him with a cautious and defensive expression. Yi Mubai thought that this child didn't look at him like this before. Xiangnan used to like him very much and always called him uncle. But now was he unhappy because he called him father? Yi Mubai parked the car in front of a children's restaurant and took him to eat his favorite fried chicken. Although it was not nutritious, it was okay to eat it occasionally to make the child happy. After ordering, a lot of delicious food was piled up in front of Xiangnan. But Yi Xiangnan was not interested. He drank his drink and looked at Yi Mubai. Uncle, when will you take me home? Yi Mubai felt a pain in his heart. He reached out and rubbed the little guy's head. Xiangnan, didn't I tell you that I'm a father, not an uncle? He didn't expect him to understand, but Xiangnan nodded. I know. Yi Mubai frowned. Did Mom tell you that? At home, I used to call Dad uncle, so uncle is Dad. The little guy was only 3 years old, but he was able to explain such a complicated relationship so clearly. Yi Mubai was stunned for a moment. Then he thought that this child was quite smart, just like Bai Anan. He had inherited the intelligence of the Yi family. He had mixed feelings. After all, he was his own child. It would be a lie to say that he did not like him. Moreover, Xiangnan was so adorable. He could not bear to part with him. But it would be too cruel for him, and Wen Yuan to go to court and snatch Xiangnan away. He wanted to marry Wen Yuan for Xiangnan, but that woman did not agree. Therefore, he and Wen Yuan had no other relationship except for the fact that they shared a son. No matter how tempting her body was, there was no need for him to sleep with such a stupid woman. Yes, stupid. Yi Mubai ruffled his son's hair and said gently, After you finish eating, Daddy will take you to buy some gifts, and then send you to Mommy's place. As he spoke, his voice was a little hoarse. He leaned over and pressed his forehead against Xiangnan's. You will still live with Mommy in the future, but if you miss Daddy, you can call me, and Daddy will appear, okay? Xiangnan stared at him in a daze. Yi Mubai felt a little sad in his heart. He smiled gently and said, In the future, you have to call me Daddy. He was just angry before, but now facing Xiangnan, he was even more angry at that cruel woman. For the so-called dream and self-esteem, she let Xiangnan grow up in a single-parent family. Wen Yuan was the most unreasonable woman he had ever met. He really wanted to strangle her to death. End of this chapter. Chapter 3751. Xiangnan looked at him. After a while he lowered his head and said, Okay, dejectedly. Then he leaned on him again. He looked so pitiful that he couldn't even enjoy his meal. Yi Mubai reached out and touched his little head. His heart ached a little. Perhaps at this moment, He hated when Yuan the most. Xiangnan didn't enjoy his meal. After a while he looked at Yimubai. Daddy, do you want to eat? Daddy isn't hungry. Yimubai's voice was indifferent. Xiangnan responded with an "oh," and became even more dejected. After a while, he handed over a drumstick. Without saying anything, he gave it to Yimubai. Yimubai looked at him, then silently took it and took a bite. Xiangnan chuckled softly. At that moment, Yimubai loved Xiangnan very much, but he also felt a little guilty. It was an indescribable feeling. Later, he took Xiangnan to the amusement park to play for 2 hours. Then he went to buy gifts. From toys to clothes and shoes, the whole trunk was piled up. On the way when Yuan called, Yimubai raised his hand to look at the time. It was already past 8 o'clock. He picked up the phone. I'll send him back in a while. She didn't say anything. He couldn't help but mock her again. Don't worry. I'm not a person who goes back on his word. He thought that she wouldn't say anything. Unexpectedly, when Yuan still said, Yimubai, actually there's no reason for you to hate me. Then why do you hate me? Is there a reason? From start to finish, we were just a man and a woman. His voice was low and cold. It was because he missed Nan and fell asleep that he spoke to her like this. When Yuan was embarrassed and directly hung up the phone, Yimubai pursed his lips and also hung up the phone. When driving back, he looked at the rearview mirror from time to time and looked at Xiangnan. Xiangnan slept soundly. After all, he was a 3-year-old child. He was tired after playing for a whole day. The car arrived at her apartment building. When Yuan was waiting downstairs, he stopped the car, opened the backseat door, and carried Xiangnan to her. He took Xiangnan's gift and followed her upstairs. When Yuan was a little uneasy, after arriving at the apartment, she put Xiangnan down and asked softly, You're leaving tomorrow? When Yuan didn't know what to say, so he could only say, I'll see you off. He stood there without moving. As soon as she walked away, she pressed herself against his chest, as if throwing herself into his embrace. Yimubai stared at her. Miss Wen, what tricks are you playing now? When she fell into his arms, she was so dizzy that she could not get up in time, and he thought that she had seduced him. Slowly standing up, she did not explain to herself, because there was no need. He had already determined that she was seducing him. Yimubai stared at her for a long time before saying in a hoarse voice, I'm leaving. There's a film to be shot. It might be 4 months after it's done. I'll call Xiangnan. She nodded lightly, not saying anything. Yimubai wanted to say something, but he felt that there was no need. At this moment, he also realized that she was wearing a very conservative set of home clothes, and she was very tightly wrapped up. He couldn't help but sneer. In the future, he would not sleep with her, even if she took off all her clothes. He left without any reluctance to leave. He just went to Xiangnan's room, kissed the little boy, and covered him with the quilt. Yimubai had never been a father, but he wasn't young anymore. He knew how to love and care for a child. Perhaps he would reject a scheming woman, but he wouldn't reject a gentle child like Xiangnan. This was his flesh and blood. He didn't need a DNA test to be sure. When Yuan stood at the door, looking at him quietly, when he looked up his eyes met hers. After a long time he said softly, When Yuan, you think you're great, but in fact you're very selfish. You're very cruel to Xiangnan. With that he walked past her. And when Yuan stood in the corridor, his whole body cold. In the end, Yimubai still left. On such a lonely night, when Yuan stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling window, looking into the distance. The plane took off at the airport. Did he leave? Later, she heard that he broke up with Lin Xuanyi. Later, there was a rumor that he had an affair with a Chinese star in the United States. That girl was a newcomer, the female lead of his film. After the filming of his film was completed, the photo of the girl sitting on his lap, at the celebration party, was published on the front page of all the major magazines. That young female star with a bright future openly said that Yimubai was everything she imagined a man to be. When Yuan was far away, occasionally, she would see news of him. She just watched quietly. In their world, there was no intersection except for Xiangnan. He would call once or twice a week, and talk to Xiangnan for about half an hour. Since Nan was talking in his room, Huamian wouldn't be there to listen. Yimubai never came back. It was not until the spring festival that when Yuan heard from Bai Shuili that Yi Mubai was coming back, and he might even bring a girlfriend back. Was it that female star Lin Danny? When Yuan stood by the window, looking at the fine snow outside quietly. After a long time, she chuckled softly, somewhat mockingly. Her phone rang. She walked over to pick it up. It was a call from Xiangnan's teacher. He sounded very anxious. Miss Wen, Yi Xiangnan is not feeling well. He has been sent to the hospital. Please hurry over. It's the hematology department of XX Hospital. Chapter 3752. After when Yuan went to the hospital, everything was blurry. She could only hear the doctor's voice. The child needs further examination. We can't rule out a rare chronic disease. When Yuan's legs were a little weak. After a while, she looked up and asked, "Is there a good treatment plan?" The doctor shook his head gently. At present, in addition to bone marrow matching, we can use the umbilical cord blood of newborn babies of the same father and mother. We suggest using the second plan. After all, the rejection rate is low, and the recurrence rate is low. In addition, the child will suffer less. Moreover, the first plan is not easy to find a match. Perhaps the family members and the bone marrow banks of the world can't find a suitable match. Then we have to use the second plan. You think about it carefully. Although it is a chronic disease, the earlier it is treated, the better. After the doctor finished speaking, he signed a piece of paper given by the nurse and left. When Yuan stood there alone for a long time, she was a little helpless. At this moment she was desperate. Xiangnan was her everything. She couldn't live without Xiangnan. Yi Mubai once said that she was selfish. For her own sake, she didn't care about Xiangnan's feelings. It seemed that she was a selfish person, who only cared about her own feelings. If she had agreed to Yi Mubai's proposal, would Xiangnan be lying alone in the hospital today? When Yuan walked to the door of the sterile room, Xiangnan had to be isolated for 3 days and treated with ultraviolet rays. His small body lay there quietly, his face a little pale. How could her Xiangnan get such a disease? He had always been so healthy and lively. The doctor's words came back to her mind. He had pneumonia a while ago. In fact, it was a manifestation of this disease. It was just that we neglected it at the time and didn't check it out. When Yuan's face was pressed against the cold glass, she closed her eyes gently and felt very guilty. It was her who neglected Xiangnan because of the appearance of Yi Mubai. If she had paid more attention and cared more about Xiangnan, it wouldn't have taken so long to find out. She felt guilty, and her heart was being cut by a knife. Her tears were stained with the cold glass. Only she could understand the feeling of her heart being cut by a knife. Xiangnan needed to be isolated for 3 days. She only went in for a short period of time the next morning. Xiangnan woke up. He looked at her weakly and called her mother. "Am I seriously ill? Mom, am I going to die?" When Yuan clenched her hand and kissed him. "No, you won't." Xiangnan's eyes weren't as bright as before, but he tried to raise his hand to comfort his mother. "Mom, Xiangnan isn't afraid of pain. I want to live to be with you." That small head was pressed against her neck. When Yuan's sadness reached its peak. As a mother, Xiangnan's mother, she couldn't care less about her pride and everything else. She lowered her head and kissed Xiangnan. "Good girl, everything will be fine." Thinking of Nan, he fell asleep in this short period of time. When Yuan reached out and gently caressed his face, she said in a low voice, "Xiangnan, Mommy won't let anything happen to you." The nurse reminded her that it was time for her to go out. When Yuan walked out and watched quietly for a long time, she called Yi Mubai in the corridor. It rang for a long time before the call was picked up. It was a girl's voice. "Director Yi is taking a shower." "Director Yi? It must be one of his artists." The voice was young. It could be Lin Danny. When Yuan was embarrassed, she said softly, "Wait for him." "Okay, can you ask him to call me? I'm Wen Yuan." The girl was polite. She said that she would pass the message and hung up soon. When Yuan kept waiting for Yi Mubai's call. He didn't call, and she stood at the window in the hallway and continued to wait. She kept waiting. He was taking a shower. There was a woman beside him. When Yuan knew what was happening, she closed her eyes. She was confused about having a child with a man like this. She also felt disgusted, but she had no choice. She stood there, her eyes a little wet. She waited for a long time. It was about an hour or two. When Yuan's heart was almost numb. Chapter 3753. When her heart was numb, Yi Mubai called. His voice was cold. What's the matter? When Yuan held the phone and moved her lips, but she couldn't make a sound for a long time. Her senses seemed to be numb. After a long time, she found her voice again. Her voice was unbelievably hoarse. Yi Mubai, Xiangnan is sick. On the other end of the phone, the breath seemed to freeze. Yi Mubai clenched the phone and said after a while, "How is Xiangnan?" "Very bad." When Yuan sniffed and said in a low voice, "Can you go back to H City? I know. I'm disturbing you." Yi Mubai was silent for a few seconds. It was like a whole night of torture for Wen Yuan. After a long time he finally said, "Xiangnan is also my son." He paused for a few more seconds. "I'll be in H City tomorrow morning." The phone in Wen Yuan's hand slipped down. She was at a loss. She suddenly covered her face and almost burst into tears. Yi Mubai flew to H City at 4 o'clock in the morning. When he appeared at the hospital, Wen Yuan wasn't asleep. She was sitting on the bench in the aisle. She hadn't slept for almost 36 hours. Her face was a little haggard and frighteningly pale. He slowly walked to her. The light at the top of the aisle made his shadow very long, blocking half of Wen Yuan's face. Wen Yuan suddenly raised her eyes and looked straight at him. Yi Mubai slowly sat down next to her and lit a cigarette. It wasn't until now that he asked about Xiangnan's condition. What's wrong with Xiangnan? He knew in his heart that it was a serious illness. Otherwise, with Wen Yuan's awkward personality, she wouldn't have taken the initiative to ask him to come back. Wen Yuan put her hands on her knees and lowered her eyes. After a long time, she said in a low voice, "It's a blood disease. A bone marrow transplant or another child." Yi Mubai listened but didn't say anything. He leaned his tall body against the back of the chair and blew out a smoke ring. In the gray smoke, she couldn't see his expression clearly. She didn't know what he was thinking, so she didn't dare to ask. After smoking a cigarette, he went to the door of the sterile room and quietly looked at Xiangnan. Until dawn. At dawn the doctor came over. He talked to the doctor alone for a while, and Wen Yuan waited at the door of the office. In just 1 day and 2 nights, the radiance on her face seemed to have disappeared. When Yi Mubai came out, his expression was somewhat solemn. His gaze was somewhat deep as he looked at Wen Yuan. Wen Yuan pursed his lips and asked softly, "What did the doctor say?" Yi Mubai ignored her and took a few steps forward. Then he paused. He turned his head and stared into her eyes. Then he said softly, "Let's get married and have a child." Her lips trembled and her chest heaved up and down as she stared at him in a daze. She did not understand what he meant. After a long time, she came back to her senses. "Actually, we only need to have a child. We don't need to get married. You have your own private life." Yi Mubai stared at her, his eyes filled with a cold light. When Wen Yuan looked up and saw the expression in his eyes, she shrank back and knew that he was mocking her. "Wen Yuan," he said, "don't you think you're being too cruel to Xiangnan?" He took a step forward and stood less than half a meter away from her. He said hoarsely, "He's sick. He needs a normal family and a father." This book came from Chapter 3754. She stared into his eyes helplessly. His expression was a little impatient. "Don't talk to me about love, understand? Right now, you're playing the role of Yi Xiangnan's mother, not just Wen Yuan." As he spoke, he held her chin and lifted her face, his expression getting closer to hers. "If you don't agree, we don't have to give birth to the child. I'll take him to America." After saying that, he suddenly let go of her face. Wen Yuan couldn't help but take 2 steps back. He strode away, probably to see Xiangnan. Wen Yuan stood there alone. She felt that her surroundings were quiet, and everything had nothing to do with her. In her mind, there was only Yi Mubai's words. She was Xiangnan's mother, not just Wen Yuan. After some time, when Wen Yuan went to Xiangnan's ward, she saw Yi Mubai change into sterile clothes and enter. He squatted in front of Xiangnan's bed, his side profile looking especially gentle. He was talking to Xiangnan. There was fragility on Xiangnan's face, but there was also a touch of peace. His little face gently leaned on his father's shoulder, and his little face was shy. At that moment, when Yuan thought that Xiangnan needed a father, especially at a time like this, Yi Mubai was right. When Yuan stood outside and watched quietly, when Xiangnan saw her, he gave her a small smile. This smile supported Yi Mubai, and when Yuan's subsequent marriage, no matter how cold he was later, she never mentioned a divorce. When Yi Mubai came out, Xiangnan fell asleep again. He gently closed the door and took off his mask. When Yuan stood in front of him, a head shorter than him, they were a little close, and she lowered her head, so he couldn't see her face clearly. He only heard her say softly, "Yi Mubai, let's get married." He stared at her but didn't say anything. He used Yi Mulan's connections to hire the best medical team to give Xiangnan the best care. Only then did when Yuan realize that marrying him had many benefits. Yi Mubai took her back to her apartment. After taking a shower, he quietly smoked a cigarette and looked at her. "I brought the household register." Ah. She was a little absent-minded, and her expression was blank. He pursed his thin lips. "Get married." When Yuan's heart was pounding heavily, after a while, she returned to her room and began to rummage through her household register. Usually, she was a tidy person, but at this time, she had completely forgotten where her household register was. She searched for a long time before she found it. When she went out, Yi Mubai was still smoking. He looked at her. When Yuan stood and looked down, "I'm done." He got up. "Change into your shoes." She went to change her shoes in a panic. She followed his instructions almost immediately. When they reached his car downstairs, he extinguished the cigarette butt and started the car. The person who helped them was the leader of the Civil Affairs Bureau. In other words, it was a secret marriage. When Yuan didn't have any objections. At this time, as long as she could save Xiangnan and give her a child, she was willing to do anything. After reading the vows mechanically, they took a photo and stamped it. They became legally married. There was no wedding ring, no kiss. It was just a process. But the result was that she became his wife. This used to be everything in Wen Yuan's dreams. But now, she only felt a little miserable. She even regretted that if she hadn't stubbornly pursued him back then, Xiangnan wouldn't have been born, and wouldn't have gotten such an illness. But now, she had no way out. She had to be responsible for her child. No matter how embarrassing this marriage was, she had to endure it. The marriage certificate in her hand was heavy. She looked up. Coincidentally, Yi Mubai was also looking at her. He didn't say anything. He just placed the certificate in her hand. "Keep it well." Then he turned around and walked in front. When Yuan followed silently, the leader wiped his sweat. This was the first time he didn't know how to bless a pair of newlyweds. He had just gone through the marriage procedures, not a divorce, right? In his opinion, it was more like a funeral scene. Oh my God, this was really difficult. This couple's identities were so prominent. This book came from Chapter 3755. Yi Mubai brought Wen Yuan downstairs. When they got into the car, he asked calmly, "Are you going to America, back to B City, or staying here?" Wen Yuan lowered his eyes and said after a long while, "I want to stay here." She didn't want to go to America, and Xiangnan wasn't used to it either. Moreover, how could she return to B City after marrying him? She thought that if she stayed in H City, they wouldn't have many chances to meet each other. Perhaps after having a child, he would ask for a divorce because they didn't have feelings for each other. That was what she thought. Yi Mubai held onto the steering wheel and said calmly, "I won't get a divorce." He turned his head and looked at her quietly. No matter what the quality of this marriage is like. Wen Yuan's breathing was a little chaotic again. Why? He stared at her for a long time, but didn't answer her. He started the car. He took her back and told her that he had bought an apartment here, and would be moving there today. After Xiangnan was discharged, they would be living there. Wen Yuan was a little shocked. "Why are you moving? Isn't this place good?" He looked around and said calmly, "This place is too small." 100 square meters couldn't accommodate him. Wen Yuan was still a little stunned. He said straightforwardly, "Other than the days when we sleep on the same bed, there's no need for us to sleep together." His words were like a slap to her face. Wen Yuan said calmly, I understand. He sat on the sofa and glanced at her. Everything is ready. You just need to pack up your and Xiangnan's clothes. Wen Yuan lowered his eyes and went back to the room to pack his and Xiangnan's things. Yi Mubai took the 2 big suitcases. The apartment he bought was very close to here. It was only a 5-minute drive. The location was better and the environment was better. Wen Yuan had to admit that it would be more suitable for Xiangnan to recuperate here after being discharged. She didn't object anymore, and took it as his concern for Xiangnan. The apartment was a 6-story bungalow. He bought the top floor, which was more than 300 square meters. There were 3 suites, a large living room, and a game room. The renovation was very good, and there were soft woolen blankets everywhere, suitable for children. When Yuan moved his things into a suite, she thought it was a guest room, but it was actually the master bedroom. Yi Mubai looked at it and didn't say anything, but his gaze was deep. After Wen Yuan was done cleaning up, he sat quietly in Xiangnan's room for a while. The room was decorated in a Mediterranean style with blue as the main theme. All boys would like it. She gently stroked the bedsheets, a little lost in thought. Yi Mubai stood at the door of the bedroom and looked at her quietly. Take a break. We'll visit Xiangnan in the afternoon and come back at night. I don't need to rest. She looked up with her eyes wide open. I want to go to the hospital now. He looked at her for a long time, then said slowly, If you want to have healthy children, you'd better listen to me. She bit her lip, nodded, and walked back to her bedroom to lie down. When Yuan was lying on the bed, she didn't know what he was doing. Was he resting or something else? The door to her room was open, and she heard him on the phone, probably talking to Lin Danny. When Yuan pulled the blanket up silently, she didn't want to listen, nor did she want to hear what he was saying. Yi Mubai hung up the phone, after talking for about 4 to 5 minutes. Later, when Yuan heard the sound of the door closing, she slowly sat up. After a while, she walked around the apartment, but he didn't come back. When Yuan's heart skipped a beat, she changed her clothes and took a taxi to the hospital. This book came from Chapter 3756. She went to the hospital and went up to that floor. She stood on the other side of the corridor and saw Yi Mubai standing at the door of the ward, looking at Xiangnan quietly. At that moment, Wen Yuan felt very sad. There were tears in her eyes as she looked straight at him. Yi Mubai turned his head and saw Wen Yuan. He gazed at her quietly. There was some warmth in his eyes, and they were no longer as cold as before. Wen Yuan walked over and stood next to him. He said hoarsely, He will be transferred to a normal ward the day after tomorrow. If everything goes well, he can be discharged in 10 days and recuperate at home, but he has to come for a checkup every week. He turned to look at her. It's best if we have a child within a year. Wen Yuan's face was a little pale. He stared at her and didn't say anything. In the afternoon, Xiangnan woke up for a short while. Wen Yuan went in to see him and talked to him for a while. She reached out and touched her son's hair with a gentle expression on her face. When she came out, it was already night time. There were 2 special class nurses in the ward to take care of him. They went home. Both of them were very tired. After ordering dinner, he went to the study. Wen Yuan was extremely tired. She took a shower and lay on the bed. At midnight, she was woken up by someone kissing her. She opened her eyes and looked at his handsome face under the dim light. At that moment she was pressed under his body. Wen Yuan woke up immediately. She pursed her lips and looked at him. Yi Mubai. He kissed her neck gently. His voice was hoarse. Is it your pregnancy period? Wen Yuan opened her eyes and looked at the ceiling. He nodded and shook his head. But he knew that it was her pregnancy period. So he lowered his head and kissed her lips, kissing her all the way down. They had done it many times before. Wen Yuan liked it when he hugged her. But it was different this time. She remembered that when she called him, he was taking a shower, and it was Lin Danny who picked up the phone. Her imagination was like a wild horse that had broken free. When Yuan's pupils constricted, she suddenly pushed Yi Mubai away. Her body curled up as she sat on the bed, her hands hugging her body. Yi Mubai narrowed his eyes. Wen Yuan. His expression was slightly distorted because of Yu Wang. He reached out and pulled her into his arms. Wen Yuan struggled instinctively in his arms. No. Why not? He lowered his head and stared at her face unhappily. Wen Yuan, don't be emotional. Don't you want a child? Xiangnan is still lying in the hospital. In his arms, she raised her head and looked at him silently. Then, a tear fell from the corner of her eye. He pushed her down again, wanting her. Wen Yuan did not struggle anymore. Her fingers gripped the bedsheets tightly as she endured him in the dim light. It was a little humiliating. She didn't feel much either. She just endured it mechanically like a puppet. Yi Mubai didn't seem to have any interest. He just wanted to make her pregnant. After it was over, the air was suffocating. Doing it was more uncomfortable than not doing it. Wen Yuan lay on the bed with tears in the corner of his eyes. Yi Mubai immediately lifted the quilt and got off the bed. After taking a shower, he walked out of the bedroom. There was no hug after the deed. There was no warmth. There was only obligation. Wen Yuan sat in a daze for a long time. Then she moved her body to the bathroom and washed herself. When she lay on the bed again, she didn't sleep for half the night. She opened her eyes and looked at the dark night outside. It was just like their marriage. It was so cold. Today's update is over. Happy New Year, everyone. New Year's Eve. End of this chapter. Chapter 3757. Wen Yuan lay there quietly for a long time, until her eyes were sore and dry. She didn't know how many times they would have to do it to get pregnant. At this moment, she even regretted taking a shower just now. Just like that, she felt very conflicted and afraid of the future. In the guest room, Yi Mubai lay flat on his back. The lights were off, and he raised one hand to cover his eyes. The sex incident just now was like a movie in his mind. He was a mature man, and he couldn't be more clear about her reaction just now. Wen Yuan didn't let go at all. She didn't even feel that she was resisting having sex with him. He probably knew why she was doing it, because Lin Danny was the one who answered the phone that day. Yi Mubai didn't want to explain to Wen Yuan that their marriage was for Xiangnan. In the past, now, and in the future. He was already very tired, and he didn't want to waste any more time on comforting her little feelings. That's it, he thought lightly. They didn't feel sleepy until the next day. There was nothing special the next day. They went to see Xiangnan together. In the afternoon, Wen Yuan went to handle the resignation procedures. The reason was that the child was sick, and the hospital tried their best to keep him. Because the female dean was in her 50s, and her daughter was about the same age as Wen Yuan, she felt deeply about Wen Yuan's situation. Moreover, Wen Yuan was excellent in all aspects. The dean sighed in the end. Wen Yuan, as long as you want to come back, you can come to me at any time, as long as I'm in this school. Wen Yuan was also very touched. She nodded vigorously. Okay. When she walked out of the school, Yi Mubai was sitting in the car. He was wearing sunglasses, but his aura and aura were too strong, especially for girls in their 20s. There were several girls surrounding his car, asking for his autograph. Yi Mubai ignored them, and his face was expressionless. When Wen Yuan was a few meters away, she stopped in her tracks. She was a little unsure if she should go over or not. Yi Mubai saw her, and through a layer of sunglasses, she couldn't see his expression clearly. She only knew that his eyes were deep and serene. She still walked over, opened the door quietly and sat in. He didn't start the car immediately. Instead, he turned sideways. Done. She nodded. Yes, done. He looked at her and started the car. Wen Yuan thought that they would be silent in the car. But when his slender fingers held the steering wheel and focused on driving, he found time to talk. The content of their conversation was about childbirth. Yi Mubai's voice was faint. Wen Yuan, I'll be in H City for a while. He paused for a moment and turned to look at her before continuing. You know what I mean, right? We need to get pregnant in the shortest time possible. So we need to make love during your pregnancy. I don't want you to reject me. You can choose not to respond, but don't push me away. Otherwise, it'll be hard for me to continue. He spoke calmly, but his words were extremely cruel, making Wen Yuan feel extremely embarrassed. She didn't say anything. She just looked out of the window. Her heart was a little cold, and she couldn't describe the feeling. She wanted to cry, but she couldn't. Women were different from men. Her child was sick. As a woman, she was not in the mood to live a married life, not to mention that their marriage was so cold. When Yuan didn't want to do it, the more formulaic and mechanical it was, the more disgusted she felt. She even felt that she was dirty. She didn't say anything to him. She didn't say anything. And what was there to say? This book came from Chapter 3758. Back at the apartment, when Yuan quietly went to cook. Although she came from a good family, her culinary skills were very good. She couldn't understand why Xiangnan, who had always been healthy, suddenly fell sick. She lowered her eyes and cooked absent-mindedly. She didn't know if it was to fill her stomach or to fulfill her duty as a wife. However, she was thinking that her duty was actually to lie flat and let him make love to her until she got pregnant. Or rather, she had never been his wife, and they were only in a cooperative relationship. She was so absent-minded that she accidentally got a cut on her hand. It wasn't too deep, but a few drops of blood seeped out. When Yuan was actually a little numb, but when she saw the dark red blood, she still let out a soft moan. Yimubai was on the phone. When he heard the sound, he quickly walked over. When he saw the blood on her finger, he immediately took a tissue to help her press on the wound. Her hand was surrounded by him. It was warm, strong, and a little rough. He held her hand and looked down at her. "I'll help you bandage it." "No need." When Yuan shook her head and bit her lip. He had already brought her to the living room, without allowing her to refuse. He took out the first aid kit, helped her disinfect it, and bandaged it with a layer of gauze. Yimubai pursed his lips. "It's done." She moved her finger. There was no problem, so she said softly, "I'll go cook." "No need order a meal," he said softly. When Yuan was very insistent. "It'll be done in a while." With that, she went to the kitchen. Yimubai looked at her back view, his brows furrowed. There was an indescribable feeling in his heart. She was running away from him. Although Yimubai didn't care much about their relationship, whether they were husband and wife or not, it didn't matter. But at this moment he still sighed. Such a marriage. When Yuan continued to cook, she made 3 dishes and a soup. It was delicious, especially the thick soup, which had the taste of home. Yimubai sat with her and ate. He looked at the gauze on her fingertips and said softly, "When Xiangnan comes back, find a servant from home. You don't have to find one outside. Just transfer one from home and be city." When Yuan raised her eyes and looked at Yimubai warily, she said softly, "Yimubai, do you want others to know that I married your brother before marrying you?" He put down his chopsticks. "What do you have to be afraid of? Or do you think the servants at home wouldn't know that we slept together that afternoon?" When Yuan was speechless, she bit her lip. Yimubai continued, "If you don't object, then it's decided. When Yuan is not only doing this for you, but also for Xiangnan. You can't care too much after you're pregnant." When Yuan no longer objected, she lowered her head and ate very little. Yimubai frowned. "When Yuan, I know. I'll try my best to eat more." She looked up at him and said softly, "I'm going to get pregnant." "I know." She ate slowly and tried her best to eat. He realized that she had lost a lot of weight in just a few days. When he held her waist last night, it was very thin. She didn't look like a mother who had given birth to a child at all. Yimubai stared at her for a long time before saying softly, "What I mean is that you need to take care of Xiangnan." She pursed her lips and lowered her head again. She didn't say anything and just ate. Their interaction was very strange. After eating, she felt uneasy, afraid that he would ask to sleep with her. But they couldn't get pregnant if they didn't sleep in the same room. This book came from Chapter 3759. When Yuan lay on the bed, feeling a little tormented. She didn't know if she was waiting for Yimubai to come over, but she really couldn't sleep. As soon as she closed her eyes, she felt that he would suddenly appear in the next second, press on top of her, and do all kinds of things to her. At 12 o'clock in the morning, when Yuan woke up, her back was covered in sweat. She sat up, hugged herself with her hands, and quietly fell into a daze. After a long time, she looked at the time and lay down again. Eventually, she couldn't take it anymore and went to take a shower. She wanted to go outside to get a glass of water. When she passed by Yi Mubai's room, his bedroom light was on, but there was no one there. Wen Yuan stood quietly for a while, a little absent-minded. Later, she went to get a glass of water, walked to the French windows, opened the curtains and quietly looked at the night outside. But when the curtains slowly opened, Wen Yuan's gaze was fixed. She looked at everything in front of her in disbelief. On the first floor, Yi Mubai was only wearing a shirt and black trousers. A very young girl was hugging him, her slender arms around his neck, and her whole body was in his arms. The girl was very young and beautiful. From the side profile, Wen Yuan could tell that it was Lin Danny, and their hug was a kiss that they hadn't seen for a long time, and a girl's complete dependence. Wen Yuan watched quietly, and the blood in her body seemed to have frozen. She was Yi Mubai's wife, and she lived in his house. They had a child together, and they were about to have a second child. But on a night like this, she saw another girl with him, and it made her feel that she was actually a third party. Wen Yuan knew that she should avoid it. A smart woman should pretend that she didn't see it, because she still needed Yi Mubai as her husband. She needed him to make love to her and conceive a child. Although at this moment, she felt as uncomfortable as if she had eaten a fly. Wen Yuan watched as Yi Mubai gently pushed Lin Danny's hand away, but Lin Danny immediately hugged him again. This time, he didn't push Lin Danny away. Wen Guang watched quietly until he inadvertently looked up and saw Wen Yuan upstairs. His eyes met hers in the dark night, a young girl in his arms. After a long time, Yi Mubai lowered his head and said something to Lin Danny. Then, they got into the car, and Yi Mubai drove Lin Danny away. Wen Yuan just stood there, looking at the dark night, watching his car disappear. It was as if he would have to wait until dawn. It was as if he would have to wait until the end of time. Of course, she wouldn't wait forever. Half an hour later, she drank the glass of cold water and returned to her bedroom. She lay on the bed, half asleep and half awake. All she could think of were bizarre dreams. When she woke up, the apartment was still quiet. There was no sound at all. Yi Mubai only came back when it was almost dawn. His voice was very soft. He stood at the door for a while, and then went to take a shower. Wen Yuan woke up, but he lay on the bed without moving. He showered, went to her bedroom, and went to her bed. Her pajamas were thrown to the foot of the bed, and he was doing things to make her pregnant. Wen Yuan lay there without moving, but when he looked away, there were tears in his eyes. She didn't ask him about Lin Danny, and he didn't explain either. After such an absurd sex act, he left her and left her bedroom. The house was still quiet. She lay on the bed, her nose a little red, and her eyes even redder. This book came from Chapter 3760. She thought that she didn't care, but when he came back to shower and asked for her again, she felt terrible. That night, it was like a thorn in Wen Yuan's heart, and she couldn't pull it out for many years. It was like she was sick, and no one could save her. Yi Mubai didn't intend to save her either. All the love, admiration, and love she once had for him completely ended that night, leaving only the image of him and Lin Danny hugging each other. The days passed, and Xiangnan was admitted to a normal ward. Wen Yuan often went to accompany him, and every time she stayed, it would be a whole day. Although Yi Mubai was in City H, he would fly to other places from time to time. When he wasn't around, Wen Yuan would spend the night in the hospital, and when he was around, she would return to the apartment, because they had to have a child. Although she was already resisting, and even hated doing it with him, she had no choice. She couldn't refuse. On the third day after Yi Mubai flew to America, an unexpected yet expected girl appeared in front of Wen Yuan. It was Lin Danny. Wen Yuan met her outside the hospital, and they had a cup of coffee together. Lin Danny was very young, and she had a special temperament. Bai Shueli had this temperament, Lin Sisi had it, and Wen Yuan also had it. But they were all spoiled when they were young and had a better family background. Wen Yuan never watched gossip. Later on, she found out that Lin Danny was the daughter of a film company, so she was like herself in the past, passionately chasing after a man, as if the whole world had nothing to do with her, and there was only one man in her life. Wen Yuan lowered her head and took a sip of coffee. She deliberately didn't add sugar, so it was a little bitter. But she would rather it be a little bitter, so that she would be a little more clear-headed in front of a girl who was 5 years younger than her. Lin Danny was more photogenic than in the movies. Her face was very small, and she was very beautiful. When Yuan took a look at her, and she knew why Yi Mubai chose her as the female lead, and even why they were together. Because Lin Danny was very much like someone. Very much like Lin Cece, the person that Yi Mubai had been thinking about until now. Lin Danny said faintly, "I didn't know you were married, Miss Wen. You don't mind me calling you Miss Wen, right? I know you. You're very famous in B City. Not only are you the daughter of the Wen family, but you're also Yi Mulin's former wife. But I won't admit that you're Mubai's wife. Although you've registered your marriage, I don't think he sees you as his wife." Wen Yuan looked at the girl in front of him and smiled. "Call me whatever you want." Lin Danny's gaze was a little aggressive, but it wasn't strange. Not many girls like her were innocent, and Wen Yuan never thought that he was. Lin Danny stared into Wen Yuan's eyes and said softly, "I won't give up on him. Your marriage to him will not last." Wen Yuan still lowered her head and sipped the coffee in the cup. After a while, she said in a low voice, "Then keep a low profile. Legally, he's a married man, and you're the most talented actress in China. Don't ruin yourself." "I don't care. The most important person in my life is Yi Mubai. I just want to live in front of his camera." Lin Danny brushed her hair indifferently. Wen Yuan raised her eyes and looked at the girl in front of her in a daze. She seemed to have said these words before, but now, it was all in the past. This book came from Chapter 3761. Wen Yuan looked at the girl in front of her. After a long time, she smiled faintly. She paid for the coffee and left. There was no accusation, no quarrel, nothing. It was because she knew that Yi Mubai didn't belong to her. Quarreling would only embarrass herself. Lin Danny could hug Yi Mubai and act coquettishly, but Wen Yuan couldn't. She was Xiangnan's mother. After seeing Lin Danny, Wen Yuan didn't have many thoughts. Even if she had any thoughts, it was that night. That night had already passed. She didn't have any thoughts. She didn't ask Yi Mubai if he and Lin Danny had sex that night. She didn't want to ask and felt that there was no need to. Sometimes, it was better to be a little muddled about marriage, especially between her and Yi Mubai. Wen Yuan went back to the ward. Xiangnan was sleeping quietly. This child had to sleep for more than 10 hours every day after he got sick. Wen Yuan felt sorry for him, but also felt lucky. This way, Xiangnan wouldn't be in so much pain. In the afternoon more people came. It was quite surprising. It wasn't just by Xueli and Yi Mulin. Even Lin Cece came. Wen Yuan never hated Lin Cece. There was no reason to hate her. It wasn't wrong to be liked. Xiangnan fell asleep. Bai Xueli stayed by his side and kissed Xiangnan. Wen Yuan felt a surge of warmth in his heart. Bai Xueli had liked Yi Mubai for many years, so she probably had special feelings for Xiangnan when she saw him. What surprised Wen Yuan even more was that Yi Mulin brought a few medical reports and bone marrow biopsy tests. There were his Su Fu's and even Yi Zhenggang's. When he handed it to Wen Yuan, his voice was soft but powerful. "If necessary, I have discussed it with Xueli. And can also accept the test." Wen Yuan's eyes were very hot. She reached out and took it. She knew that it was a very precious gift. The Yi family and Xiangnan's blood were all here. She didn't know what to say. She just clenched her fists and said in a low voice, "Yi Mubai and I want to have a child first. If it doesn't work, we will need these." She looked up. "Mulin, thank you." Yi Mulin reached out and gently touched her hair. For someone who had lived together for a few years, Wen Yuan was like a younger sister. Moreover, they weren't completely unrelated. Xiangnan was Yi Mulin's blood-related child. Wen Yuan nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. Yi Mulin, Bai Xueli and Lin Cece spent the night in City H. At night, Xiangnan woke up and was especially happy to see Yi Mulin. For the first time, he left the bed and was hugged by Yi Mulin. When Bai Xueli saw Yi Mulin holding Xiangnan, her expression was very soft. She felt that he was really a good father, not only to An, but also to Xiangnan. Beside her, Lin Cece nudged her and said, "Your Yi Mulin is a good father." Bai Xueli looked at her. "Isn't Guze good? Cece, you guys should have a child." She knew that Lin Cece had been using contraception ever since they got married. Lin Cece once told her, "Why are you avoiding it? It's not like you can give birth." She was just bluffing. If she couldn't give birth, she could just say that she was using contraception. Lin Cece leaned against her and said softly, "See, you can't blame me if you can't give birth." Her eyes were a little red. Actually, she had been a mother before, but it was too short. However, Guze seemed to be even more reserved than her. He never dared to mention children in front of her. She thought that maybe she should try again. If she couldn't get pregnant, she could only leave it to fate. Xiangnan liked the two aunties very much. He even went out for a meal with the doctor's permission. Because of his physique, Yi Mulan booked a Michelin restaurant just for Xiangnan. When they arrived, they remembered that it was Xiangnan's birthday. Cake, gifts, and a restaurant that was dressed as a birthday party. Xiangnan's little face was slightly red. He hadn't been happy for many days. When Yuan hugged him and kissed him, "Are you happy?" She didn't expect Yi Mulan and the others to prepare these. Xiangnan said that he was happy. Yi Mulan smiled faintly and said, "Shueli contacted this restaurant beforehand. Even the doctor confirmed it before they prepared it. She flew here in the morning with Cece." Then he paused for a moment. "There's also a special gift." Xiangnan looked at it eagerly. His heart was full of desire. At this moment, he felt as if he had opened Pandora's box. He was nervous and expectant. Amidst the music, Bai Anan, wearing an awkward little dress, pushed a small cart and sang "Happy Birthday, Brother" in a tone-deaf voice. She looked cute and adorable, and the song she sang was "Happy Birthday, Brother." Xiangnan was very young, but he was very sensitive. He liked Anan very much. In his eyes, Anan appeared like an angel. Later, when Xiangnan grew up, he became a sister complex. Bai Anan became his favorite, even surpassing his younger brother. This book came from Chapter 3762. There was a faint blush on Xiangnan's little face. He really wanted to hug Anan, but he was a little weak and couldn't do so he could only look at Bai Anan. Bai Anan was the prettiest girl Yi Xiangnan had ever seen in her little dress. Bai Anan tried her best to push the little cart over, and sang with all her might. In the end, she even kissed Xiangnan on the cheek. Yi Xiangnan's little friend blushed. Wen Yuan watched with mixed feelings, but she was also happy. After so many days of tension, she finally smiled. The warmth she received was given to her by Yi Mulan and by Shueli, as well as to Xiangnan. When Yuan remembered the candlelight, birthday boy, and Bai Anan, who was wearing a little dress awkwardly that night. Happiness was always a little short-lived. Xiangnan's body didn't allow him to stay outside for long. So after 2 hours, Yi Mulan sent them back to the hospital. Xiangnan was still very happy. Anan stayed there to accompany him. She took out the comic book that she had drawn, and flipped through it for Xiangnan to read. The two little ones sat together on the hospital bed, and they seemed to be very close. Bai Shueli watched and said to Wen Yuan, "Xiangnan is really very sensible." She always had feelings for Yi Mubai when they grew up. She didn't want Yi Mubai to miss out on a good woman like Wen Yuan. Bai Shueli's voice was very soft. "Wen Yuan, give Mubai some time. I believe that you will get better." Wen Yuan only smiled faintly. It wasn't appropriate for Bai Shueli to ask too much about the matters between husband and wife, so she didn't say anything else. Bai Shueli and Yi Mulan went back first, while Anan stayed there to accompany Xiangnan. Because it was a VIP ward, Wen Yuan slept on a bed alone, and the two little ones slept together intimately. Although Anan was very small, Wen Yuan felt very warm with Anan by his side. At night, when she was covering the little fellows with blankets, Wen Yuan secretly kissed Anan. She thought to herself, if she was pregnant and could give birth to a little girl, how great would that be? Looking at Anan, she didn't seem to reject pregnancy so much. It was a dark night in H City. Yi Mulan drove Bai Shueli back to the hotel. It was not easy for him to come here. His identity was a problem. He had to leave early the next morning. Shueli planned to stay with Anan for a few days. Lin Cece came with Guze. As soon as they left the hospital, Guze took her away. As for Yi Mubai, Guze still cared. Men were all like that. At this moment, Bai Shueli was sitting beside Yi Mulan. She tilted her head and looked at him. Her voice was quite soft. Mulan, are you not going to care about Mubai? Yi Mulan smiled faintly. How? Only a man can control his lower body. I'm not talking about that. Bai Shuali bit her lips. I mean, he has so many scandals with so many people. You are his big brother. Of course you can control it. Yi Mulan was focused on driving. After hearing his wife's words, he smiled faintly. I really can't control this matter. Mubai is an adult, and the relationship between him and Wen Yuan is very complicated. In my opinion, it's not that he has no feelings for Wen Yuan, but that it's not deep enough. He still has some resistance. Bai Shuali glanced at her husband bitterly. Yi Mulan, you're too weak. Yi Mulan just smiled. After a while, when they reached a red light, he turned his head to look at her. That gaze was very meaningful. It made Bai Shuali feel a little scared. She sat up straight and looked at her husband. Why are you looking at me like that? He reached out and rubbed his chin with his beautiful fingers. I'm thinking, what should I do to make Mrs. Yi feel that I'm strong? Shameless. Bai Shuali turned her face to the side and ignored him. After a while, she couldn't help but turn her head and complain to him. The older you get, the more indecent you are. Yi Mulan continued to drive. After a long time, his voice rang out. Do you think I'm old? His little worm said softly. Yes, you are old. Don't be unconvinced. He just smiled and didn't say anything. When they reached the hotel, Yi Mulan carried his wife up. Bai Shuali exclaimed. Yi Mulan, what are you doing? Book from Chapter 3763. Bai Shuali's face was blushing as her hands landed on the buttons of his shirt. Her voice was soft and delicate. Yi Mulan, you can't be thinking about it, right? Your private flight is at 8 a.m. tomorrow, and you're going to have to change to a helicopter for a meeting at 10 a.m. Just the thought of it makes me feel so busy. He looked at his little wife deeply and lowered his head to kiss her. It's tough, isn't it? Furthermore, you're going to be spending a week here. If you don't fulfill your obligations as a couple during this week, shouldn't I collect some interest first? Her little face continued to blush as she said pitifully, doing it once, is just the interest? Yi Mulan's fingers caressed her face gently as his voice was especially soft. Actually, you can pay the principal first. She was still stuttering. What do you mean pay the principal first? Yi Mulan lowered his head to kiss her. After that, he pulled back and brushed past her lips gently, hinting at her. Do it a few more times. Before she could resist, he had already proceeded without any delay. After a few more times, Bai Shuali laid on the bed and complained softly. You're already so old, and yet you don't know how to take care of your health. Yi Mulan chuckled and got up happily, carrying her to shower. By then, it was already late at night. He hugged her in his arms while he leaned against the headboard and smoked a cigarette. Bai Shuali raised her head and looked at his furrowed brows as well as his cigarette. Usually he wouldn't smoke at home. Even if he did, he would do it on the balcony. Furthermore, he was in a particularly bad mood after they had done it. Reaching out, she wrapped her slender arms around his neck and buried her face between his chin and neck. Weren't you in a good mood earlier on? Why are you smoking now? Yi Mulan lowered his head and looked at her. However, he had extinguished the cigarette and pinched her cheeks. All right, time to sleep. He was very gentle. In fact, ever since he had thought things through, he had been really nice to her. He was so nice that Bai Shuali was starting to regret running away all these years. She did not want to say anything, and he was waiting for her to take the initiative to talk about it. Their life was very sweet. They had already gotten their marriage certificate, and were just short of a wedding. But now that Mubai and Wen Yuan were like this, their wedding might have to be postponed. Bai Shuali knew that he was upset, so she took the initiative to get up from his arms. She leaned over to his side and grabbed a cigarette and lighter. She lit the cigarette and took it off her lips. She choked on it and placed it on his lips. Are you worried about Mubai? Yi Mulan stared at her, but he still took the cigarette from her. He slowly took a puff and said faintly, Mubai probably hates Wen Yuan right now. This feeling was very complicated. Even Mubai himself couldn't figure it out. Bai Shuali bit her lip and said softly after a while, I think he likes Wen Yuan. Otherwise, he wouldn't have the energy to sleep with him. Besides, if he wants a child, he can do it in a test tube. He doesn't need to get married. I can see that Mubai has a strong desire to pester him until he dies. After she said that, she raised her head and looked at him eagerly, hoping for his approval. Yi Mulan, don't you think so? Am I right? He looked at her with a deep gaze. Then he said slowly, you're quite right. She was a little smug. Yi Mulan continued. If he doesn't like him, why does he have the energy to sleep with him? As he said that, his finger gently caressed her red lips. He then extinguished the cigarette and said with a hoarse voice, next week's benefits in advance. Book from Chapter 3764. Baishuali was dumbfounded again. She placed her hands on his shoulders and sensed that he was about to make a move. She bit her lip and said, you have to rush early tomorrow. With that, she kissed him and said, Yi Mulan, be good, okay? Her eyes were shining. Be good. It was the first time that she had coaxed him like this. She kissed him every time she said something, which made Yi Mulan's heart soften. After so many years, after so many things, she finally returned to his side safe and sound. Time passed by quickly, and they would always be good. Yi Mulan lowered his head, kissed her little face and said, good. Baishuali looked up at him and said, are you really good? Otherwise, he looked at her and said, do you keep messing with me? She was a little embarrassed. She lay in his arms and rubbed against him like a kitten, which was indescribably cute. Yi Mulan's heart was extremely soft. He looked down at her and said, if you go on like this, I can't guarantee that I won't do anything to you. She cried out and lay on him even more coquettishly, hugging him. Yi Mulan turned on the light and let her lie on his body and sleep. They were a couple who had just reconciled, so they would never get tired of it. At dawn, Yi Mulan had to rush to the airport. It was 7 o'clock in H City, and it was early winter. When Baishuali woke up, he had already put on his clothes and was tying his tie. She immediately got up and knelt on the bed and said, let me do it. He bent down and kissed her on the face. You can sleep a little longer later. She tied his tie for him. Yi Mulan did not straighten up immediately, but gently rubbed against her again. Baishuali's voice was a little low. Mulan, let me take you to the airport, okay? He patted her. Don't get up. It's cold. Sleep a little longer in the hotel. And don't run around with it and without me, okay? She nodded obediently. Her expression was extremely gentle, as if she had returned to his little wife. Yi Mulan's Adam's apple rolled sexily. He couldn't help kissing her and said, I'll come over when I'm free. Don't. She immediately said, and then whispered under his suspicious gaze, it's too hard. His eyes were blazing. Baishuali bit her lips and stared at him. Then she leaned into his arms. I'll go back early. Be good. When he opened his mouth, his voice was hoarse. I should be the one saying that. She blushed and did not make a sound. She placed her hands on his chest and lifted her head to kiss him of her own accord. He didn't move and let her kiss him. After a long time, she panted and said, Yi Mulan, I'll miss you. You haven't thought about it for so many years, and now you can't stand it anymore? He rubbed her hair and smiled. She bit her lip. This is different. As for what was different, she did not know. Yi Mulan still couldn't bear for her to get up and send him off. After a while of tenderness, he still rushed back to B City for the meeting. Baishuali did not slack off for long. She lay down and talked with Lin Sisi for a while. Lin Sisi was taken away by Guze. After putting down the phone, he lay down for a while before getting up to brush his teeth and wash up. Then, he changed into a set of clothes and went to the hospital. When Yuan was alone now, he must be too busy. And Anan was also there. Baishuali went to the hospital. Anan and Xiangnan were still sleeping. They slept side by side like two cute little pigs. In fact, the two little guys were only a month apart. Xiangnan was born a month earlier and was a little older. This book came from Chapter 3765. Baishuali went in and closed the door gently. When Yuan turned back and smiled. They're not awake yet. Baishuali went over and looked at the two little fellows with Wen Yuan. When Yuan nodded, they slept a little late. Bai Shueli looked at the two little ones and said with some surprise, "They look so similar. Actually, Mu Lin and Mu Bai don't look so alike." Wen Yuan smiled. "Is that so?" She looked at Bai Shueli and hesitated for a moment. "Shueli, can we talk?" Bai Shueli was stunned for a moment and then agreed. "Okay, let's talk outside. Don't disturb them. They're sleeping so soundly." The two of them went outside together. Wen Yuan made fruit tea for Bai Shueli and sat down with her. "I made it myself." Bai Shueli took a sip. It was sweet and she smiled. "It's delicious." "It's good that you like it." Wen Yuan continued. "I'll send some back to B City for you." Bai Shueli accepted it shamelessly. Then she looked at Wen Yuan and said softly, "Wen Yuan, I'm sorry. I didn't know you liked Mu Bai too. If that was the case, I wouldn't have chased him for so many years and ended up not with him." She felt that if she didn't rely on Mu Bai, Wen Yuan might have had a chance. Wen Yuan shook his head. "Don't think like that. It's just my personality. It has nothing to do with you. You see, after you and Mu Lin got married, he still didn't choose me. Actually, my family tried to reconcile with him, but he never expressed it. He didn't mean it. It was my obsession that led to what happened later." Bai Shueli stared at her for a long time. Wen Yuan smiled. "What's wrong?" The white rice worm slowly opened its mouth and said, "Actually, Wen Yuan, you're really amazing. Look at how I'm so straightforward when it comes to chasing a man. I've shamelessly followed Xiao Bai for so many years and even got married. When that bastard Lin Sisi appeared, Mu Bai ran away." After saying that, she felt that she had said something wrong and said in a low voice, "Actually, Sisi is in the past. She and Guze are going to get married." Wen Yuan smiled. "I know. I won't be at ease." Bai Shueli said carefully, "Wen Yuan, I really think that Lao Bai likes you. Otherwise, he wouldn't want to marry you." After saying that, she put on a confident look again. "I'm not wrong. It's a woman's intuition," Wen Yuan said slowly. "A woman's intuition tells me that he's in America and Lin Danny is there too." Bai Shueli was a little depressed. "I heard that Lin Danny's father is a big shot in the movie industry. Mu Bai, you can't be so shameless. If you want money, it's not like the Yi family doesn't have it. There's no reason for you to sacrifice yourself." Wen Yuan's voice became even more distant. "Lin Shuei, Lin Danny, don't you realize that they all look a little like Lin Sisi?" This time, Bai Shueli opened her mouth wide. "Fuck, there's actually such a thing? But it does seem to be true." It took her a long time to come back to her senses. She carefully said, "Then what do you think about Lin Danny?" "No, I just want Xiangnan to be well. I don't want anything else." Wen Yuan took a sip of tea and smiled bitterly. "So Shueli, don't worry about us." "Really? I've already woken up from my dream." Bai Shueli replied with an "oh." Just as she was about to speak, she saw Yi Mu Bai standing at the door. She cursed in her heart. When did he come over? How could she not know? This book came from Chapter 3766. Yi Mu Bai walked in slowly and paused. "How's Xiangnan?" Wen Yuan said softly. "He's sleeping with an N. He hasn't woken up yet." Yi Mu Bai looked at Bai Shueli again. Bai Shueli looked a little uncomfortable. She flipped her hair and said, I'm going out for a while. Lao Bai just came back. They must have something to talk about. It wasn't convenient for her to be around." Bai Shueli was a little annoyed. She had just talked about Lao Bai's scandal, and he came back. She was in a dilemma, but she was still worried that Lao Bai would make things difficult for Wen Yuan. She sneaked a glance at him when she went out. Yi Mu Bai glared at her, and she immediately closed the door. Then, she thought about how she was actually Lao Bai's sister-in-law. She should be dignified in front of him. Why did she not have the slightest bit of prestige? How disappointing. She patted her head, and thought that she would definitely teach Lao Bai a lesson the next time they met. Sob, it was too embarrassing. If Yi Mulin knew about this, he would definitely laugh at her and say that she was useless. In the ward, Yi Mu Bai went to see Anin and Xiangnan. The two kids were still asleep, so he walked out and sat where Bai Shueli was sitting. Wen Yuan looked up at him. "Didn't you say that you're going to be in America for a week?" "There's an international film festival in City H," he said briefly. I'll be back for a week. Wen Yuan nodded. I got it. His film's post-production had been completed, and it might be competing for awards. There were many such events. Moreover, the film was very popular, so it was all over the world. Other than seeing Xiangnan, he probably came back to have a child with her. The home he prepared was like a hotel to him. Wen Yuan didn't want to go back. She preferred to stay in the hotel. She was even afraid that he would come back. If he came back, she would have to go back to that place, lie on that humiliating bed, and make love to him. She didn't know how he could continue doing it with her now that he had Lin Danny. Wen Yuan knew that she wasn't young anymore. She didn't know why he wanted to get married. Wasn't it better to stay single in the future? Wasn't he afraid that she would take things too hard and pester him again? She remained silent. Yi Mubai paused for a moment, then said, "The crew will walk the red carpet." She looked into his eyes. She did not seem to understand what he meant, but in fact, she knew exactly what he meant. He was the director, and Lin Danny was the lead actress. It was normal to create a scandal. Was he going to tell her that he was going to have a big affair with Lin Danny in City H? She looked at him for a long time before she smiled. I know. Just 3 words, nothing else. His face turned a little ugly, and then he laughed at himself. Wen Yuan didn't know what his smile meant, but she had something to tell him about Xiangnan. What she said to Bai Shuili was true. She couldn't care less about Yi Mubai now. He could be with any woman he wanted. She only wanted Xiangnan to be fine. She was even willing to endure that kind of humiliating sex for Xiangnan, even if she thought he was dirty now, and felt a little disgusted when doing it with him. She lowered her head. Mulan came yesterday. He flew back to City B early this morning and brought this with him. She stood up and took out the few reports from the hospital for him. She lowered her eyes. Yi Mulan, let's do it too. If we can't have a baby, we can use another plan. This book came from Chapter 3767. It won't be impossible. He held them and looked down at them for a while. Then he looked up at her. Wen Yuan, do you always think like this? She bit her lip and said firmly, let's do it. I don't want anything to go wrong. Yi Mubai, maybe Xiangnan is just a child to you, but to me he's my everything. He listened to her and carefully thought about her words. Then he smiled faintly and mysteriously. Wen Yuan, he's your everything, right? He repeated her words and didn't say anything else. Because Anan and Xiangnan woke up, he went to hold his son. He hadn't seen Xiangnan for a few days, so it was inevitable that Xiangnan was a little clingy to him. Wen Yuan took care of Anan silently. When he put on the clothes for the little guy, she looked at the cute Anan and thought to herself that it would be great if she gave birth to a child like Anan. She wanted a daughter. Xiangnan seemed to like Anan. She thought absent-mindedly. On the other side, Yi Mubai took care of Xiangnan. Then, he carried one little guy in each hand and walked to the bathroom. Later, he took care of the 2 little guys and ate breakfast together. He was very patient and meticulous. Wen Yuan was a little confused when he saw it. He might be a good father, but he wouldn't be a good husband if his wife was Wen Yuan. Later, Bai Shuili came back and whispered to Wen Yuan, do you usually get along with him like this? It was too cold. How were they like husband and wife? Wen Yuan smiled faintly and didn't say anything. Bai Shuili didn't say anything either. It was a matter between husband and wife. Because Yi Mubai suddenly came back, Bai Shuili left with Anan in the afternoon. They stayed in H City for 2 days, and then returned to B City. At this time, Xiangnan was also allowed to leave the hospital by the doctor. Wen Yuan packed his things, and Yi Mubai accompanied his son. She listened to their conversation while packing. Xiangnan liked Yi Mubai a lot, but Xiangnan had grown up with Wen Yuan. Wen Yuan could feel that they both liked each other. Xiangnan treated Yi Mubai with more caution than Yi Mulan. She thought that Xiangnan probably didn't feel safe, because she didn't take care of him personally. She packed up her things, looked up at them and said softly, it's done. The couple had spent the past 2 days in the hospital. He didn't mention going back to the apartment, probably because he knew she wasn't pregnant. Wen Yuan thought silently. After she finished speaking, Yi Mubai looked up at her and said mildly, let's go. He picked up Xiangnan and carried the luggage with one hand. He was very tall, so it was easy for him. Wen Yuan only needed to follow him. Along the way they met doctors and nurses. They all knew each other after half a month. They all saw the relationship between Yi Mubai and Wen Yuan, so they all smiled and said, "Goodbye, Mr. and Mrs. Yi." Wen Yuan felt uncomfortable and just nodded stiffly. However, Yi Mubai didn't seem to care. He carried Xiangnan downstairs to the parking lot, opened the trunk with one hand, and put the luggage in. Then he put Xiangnan in the back seat and gestured for Wen Yuan to get in. Only then did he get in the car, start the car, and drive towards the apartment. On the way, Wen Yuan suddenly said, "You might be very busy later. I want you to bring Xiangnan back to the original apartment when you're not here." Yi Mubai frowned and wanted to reach for a cigarette. However, when he thought that Xiangnan was in the car, he gave up. Book from Chapter 3768. He glanced at the rearview mirror and said mildly, "If you don't like it, you can find another one until you're satisfied with it." She didn't know if he was mocking her or something else. She was a little embarrassed, but she didn't want to argue in front of Xiangnan. So she turned her face away and looked out of the window quietly, not bringing it up again. As Yi Mubai drove, he would occasionally look at her expression in the rearview mirror. After a long time, the car stopped at the entrance of the condominium. He got out of the car and took his luggage, while Wen Yuan carried Xiangnan. They looked like a family of 3, but they were too cold. Back at the condominium, she tidied up her things briefly and went to make handmade wontons for Xiangnan. Yi Mubai accompanied Xiangnan. After making it, the little guy's stomach was warm and full, and he couldn't help but want to sleep. This was also a temporary side effect of the treatment. He would want to sleep very much. Xiangnan fell asleep and Wen Yuan walked out. Yi Mubai was sitting in the living room smoking. The window was open. She walked over and sat down opposite him. He looked up at her and took a deep puff of his cigarette before saying mildly, "You still want to go back to live? Do you hate this place, or do you hate me?" Wen Yuan looked out of the window and said in a faint voice, "Yi Mubai, do you think it's interesting for us to be like this?" As soon as she finished speaking, he reached out and grabbed her arm. Before she could react, he pulled her into his arms and pressed her down on the sofa. He knelt on both sides of her body and pinched her chin with his fingers. In a low voice he said, "Wen Yuan, what else are you dissatisfied with? Do you want me to tell you that I love you? Or do you want me to treat you like how Yi Mulan treated Bai Xueli?" "I don't." She turned her face to the side, looking very embarrassed. He stared into her eyes. "Then why are you still playing with me? Isn't this good?" She turned her face and stared at him. He said it was good, but she didn't know what was good about it. She felt that it was a little ridiculous. Between them, what was good about it? Perhaps it didn't matter to him. He traveled all over the world. He had all kinds of beauties by his side. He treated this place like a hotel. And she might have to face 2 children and a loveless marriage. But he actually said it was good. But she couldn't refute. Wen Yuan's pupils contracted. Slowly, she calmed down and said softly, "Let me go." Yi Mubai pinches her chin with his slender fingers and says softly, "Do you hate me?" He laughed coldly. "Weren't you crazy about me before? Why don't you like me now, huh?" She bit her lip, unwilling to answer. She could only turn her face away from him. Because his expression was too cold, Yi Mubai stared at her, and then he lowered his head to kiss her. She was startled when his hot, thin lips covered hers, and he pinched her chin, forcing her to turn her head. At first, she thought it was just a punitive kiss, but then she realized his intention. He kissed all the way to her neck, his voice low. "Do it again." Stunned, Wen Yuan subconsciously wanted to push him away. She didn't want to do it with him. But he still pressed her down and stared into her eyes with a burning gaze. "What are you doing? Wen Yuan, I don't need to remind you that this is the duty of a married couple, right?" She closed her eyes and said softly, "I'm not pregnant." Book from Chapter 3769. After a long time, he didn't speak or continue. Finally, she couldn't help but open her eyes to look at him. His gaze was strange and cold. He stared at her eyes and said slowly, Wen Yuan, who told you that we can only have sex once when you're pregnant? Or do you think that I don't need a woman to be satisfied? Or do you want me to develop outside? Under his strong aura, Wen Yuan looked weak and helpless. She closed her eyes again. You Mubai, didn't you? He stared at her face for a long time, before he angrily lowered his head and forcefully kissed her lips. He kissed her especially forcefully, as if he wanted to hurt her and make her feel pain. That way, she wouldn't be so numb, right? Wen Yuan cried out softly. It hurts. He continued to bite her and said in a deep voice, I thought you didn't feel pain. Although she didn't want to, he still followed his male instinct and used some brute force to possess her. Wen Yuan cried because of his naughtiness. She hugged his neck and cried loudly while begging him to go to the bedroom. He didn't care and continued. His voice was cold but with a hint of decadence. It's normal for a husband and wife to do it on the sofa. After that, Wen Yuan didn't have the strength to resist anymore. After that, he carried her to the bedroom and did it twice more, as if he wanted to make up for what he had done for the past few days. After that, he went to take a shower and Wen Yuan lay down. She quietly thought about whether he couldn't be satisfied with Lin Danny, or whether he couldn't treat that spoiled girl like he treated her. At this moment, Wen Yuan forgot that she was born into a good family. From a certain point of view, she was born into a better family than Lin Danny. Perhaps it was because the person she liked first was inferior. Lin Danny was young and looked like Lin Cece, so Wen Yuan laughed at herself. She was not even as good as a substitute. She didn't lie down all the time. A woman who wasn't loved by her husband didn't have the right to lie down all the time. She had a lot of housework to do. She tidied up and had lunch. Although her legs were sore, she tried her best to endure it. After cleaning up, she went to prepare lunch. Yi Mubai frowned when he came out. He walked to the kitchen and asked, Where's the servant at home? I won't be home these few days, so I gave her a break. She went back to B City to visit her family, and will be back tomorrow. Wen Yuan said calmly as though nothing had happened. Although the servant would only be back tomorrow, she had to clean up the sofa and carefully wipe it with tissue paper. Even after wiping it several times, she was still worried that it would be seen through. In fact, Yi Mubai saw that she had used up half of the paper. He paused for a moment and said, You don't have to care so much. It's normal for a couple to do it outside. What are you worried about? Wen Yuan was actually bold and conservative. She used to be very open when she was with him, but she was a reserved woman outside and didn't show her emotions. To be honest, she wasn't the type of woman that Yi Mubai liked. This was probably the reason why they had been entangled for so long. But there was only sex and no love. He liked her body and liked to do it with her, but he didn't want to be with her for a long time. Even now, he felt that he was just making do with it. For the sake of Xiangnan, he felt that they had to live like a married couple no matter what. But obviously this was just his wishful thinking. She didn't have such plans. She didn't want to live as a married couple. It was also awkward to do it on the sofa. After Yi Mubai finished speaking, Wen Yuan's hand paused for a moment. Then, she looked at him and said softly after a long time, Yi Mubai, I can do it with you, but please respect my habits. Otherwise, I don't know how to live. He leaned against the countertop and watched her cook. In fact, he knew that she wasn't having a good time at the moment. He had done it a few times, and she had almost been exhausted by him. He could have asked her not to do it and done it for her. But he didn't say it. He must be angry, he thought. At that moment, Yi Mubai was only wearing a pair of denim trousers. It was very sturdy, and he stood beside her. Wen Yuan turned a blind eye to it. After a while Yi Mubai chuckled. Wen Yuan, don't you think you look like you're sexually apathetic right now? Her face was a little pale, and her fingers paused for a moment. After a long time she said softly, maybe. He glanced at her and left. He returned to his bedroom and put on a pure black V-neck sweater. Then, he took his car keys and went out. At night, when he looked at the news, Wen Yuan found out that he had gone to pick up Lin Danny. Their photos at the airport were taken by the reporters, and Lin Danny was hugging him in public. They looked like a golden couple, and it seemed like Yi Mubai was still single. Wen Yuan looked at the news and blinked gently. So it could be like this. So it turned out that married people could go to bed with their wives and hug their lovers. This book came from Chapter 3770. After Yi Mubai left, when Yuan took care of Xiangnan, she had almost no time to think about Yi Mubai, let alone Lin Danny. She had a negative attitude towards their marriage, from the beginning to the end. However, she was still a little absent-minded, and it was obviously because of Yi Mubai. He came back at night close to midnight, when Yuan and the child were already asleep. Yi Mubai paused for a moment, then went to the nursery to see Xiangnan. Xiangnan had always been very obedient, even when he was sleeping. He lay there obediently, and his little face looked especially calm under the night light. Even the fine hair on his face could be clearly seen, making him look even softer. Yi Mubai looked at his son under the light, and his heart softened. He sat down and reached out to gently touch Xiangnan's little face. He was afraid of waking him up, so his movements were especially gentle. He thought that he liked Xiangnan very much, so from the beginning to the end, he didn't want to go into the city with Wen Yuan. As soon as Xiangnan fell sick, he was willing, and he took the initiative. He had once wondered if he had been wrong, when Wen Yuan had been particularly cold to him. However, looking at Xiannan's gentle expression, he felt that he had been right, and that everything had been the right thing to do. Regardless of whether their marriage satisfied the adults, it made Xiangnan feel at ease, and that was enough. Yi Mubai sat for a long time before going to Wen Yuan's bedroom. He didn't want to do it with her, but simply wanted to see her. She had rejected him so coldly during the day, and he had almost forced himself, so he wanted to come and see her. He walked into her bedroom, and there was a feminine fragrance in it. It was very similar to the smell on Wen Yuan's body, and it was always fragrant. Yi Mubai's expression softened a little, and he walked in under the dim light. He stood in front of the bed and looked at her, then saw her phone on the bedside table. His gaze darkened, and his long hand reached out to grab it. He reached out and swiped it, then saw the page she had opened. Yi Mubai looked at the page for a long time, then looked at her, a little surprised. On the page was a photo of him and Lin Danny hugging. It was taken at the airport today. It could be considered a publicity stunt, but he did not deny it to the media. He also did not tell Wen Yuan about it. Their relationship as a couple was not that good. Yi Mubai thought so. Then he turned off her phone. Just as he was about to leave, Wen Yuan woke up. Her eyes were like a stream of light in the night, contrasting with her fair face, making her look very beautiful. Yi Mubai was a director, and he had high aesthetic standards. He always knew that Wen Yuan was beautiful, but her beauty was a little bland. But at this moment, she was not like that in his eyes. In the dim light, she emitted a soft light like a pearl. It was beautiful. Yi Mubai originally wanted to leave, but he stayed. Wen Yuan just stared at him in a daze. They were both studying each other's expressions, as if they could find something from those subtle changes. After a long time, he knelt beside her and began to kiss her. Wen Yuan did not react at first, and let him kiss her passionately. After a long time, when he was trying to think of what to do, her hand hit the phone on the bedside table. In an instant, Wen Yuan woke up. Her eyes were open, and she looked at the man on top of her, a little frightened. She instinctively pushed him away. Then, she clutched her collar and said softly, "I don't want to do it." He was flipped to the side, and then he stared at her and said unhappily, "But I want to." Book from Chapter 3771. You're jealous, aren't you? One as he spoke, he pulled her under him, and kissed her on the lips, burning her once. After that, Wen Yuan turned his back and was still panting. Yi Mubai didn't leave immediately. Instead, he leaned against the bed and wanted to smoke, but he gave up on it. He lowered his head and looked at her, his voice low. "What's wrong now? Don't say that you don't like me treating you like this. You clearly felt it just now." When a woman did it with a man, whether she felt it or not, men could actually feel it. She might be against it, but when he wanted her, her body didn't express it that way. After he asked, she was still lying on her stomach, unwilling to talk to him. "Lin Danny." Yi Mubai snorted softly. "There's nothing between us. I also like to fool around outside." When Yuan buried her face in the pillow and listened to him, she suddenly asked him softly, Lin Danny Lin Shiwei. They're both like Lin Cece, right? They're both surnamed Lin. Yimubai, why don't you find someone with the surname Lin to marry? Her fingers touched the pillow, and her voice was faint. We can get a divorce, really. You care about her existence? Yimubai reached out to hold her chin, and forced her to turn to look at him. His appearance and strength were a little barbaric. His voice was low. Wen Yuan, you were the one who said that you don't want feelings. You were the one who said that you don't like me. Since that's the case, why do you care so much about what I have with other people? She wanted to dodge, but he didn't allow her to. He held her face, as if he wanted to look into the depths of her soul. After a long time, Wen Yuan said in a hoarse voice, You're right, Yimubai. I don't need to care, but I have the right to reject your proposal. If it's for the sake of having a child, I'll cooperate. If not, I have the right to reject, right? After she finished speaking, he stared into her eyes and said very slowly, As you wish. He didn't say anything else, and got off the bed. When he reached the door, he heaved a sigh of relief. The inexplicable feeling he had just now must have been fake. He might as well not have done it. In the past, when Yuan was too scheming, and only wanted to climb into his bed, in his eyes, she was no different from other women. The difference was that he slept with her. Back then she was his sister-in-law. But now, she didn't want to sleep with him. He still hated her, and hated her even more. Yimubai walked back to his bedroom, and stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling window, smoking for a long time. He lay down when it was almost dawn. But then he keenly heard the sound of Wen Yuan getting up. He frowned. Why was she in such a hurry to get up? There were some things that she could let the servants at home do. But in the end, he didn't get up, nor did he have any intention of talking to her. The Cold War was probably like this. For the next few days, they spoke very little, almost as if they were strangers in a room. But on the day of a certain international film festival, there was a complete explosion. Yimubai walked the red carpet with the crew. Lin Danny wore a white dress and held Yimubai's arm, silently announcing to the world that this was her man. They even had their fingers tightly intertwined. Yimubai could have rejected it, but he didn't. He didn't know if he was deliberately testing her reaction. So he deliberately let the world see it, and also let her see it. Later, Lin Danny's lipstick mark on the collar of his shirt made him a little confused. He turned his head to look at it. Event in progress, update later. End of this chapter. Chapter 3772. Lin Danny smiled charmingly. Are you afraid? Yimubai lowered his head to look at the collar of his shirt, then looked back at her. He smiled faintly but didn't say anything. He was thinking, if Wen Yuan saw this, what kind of reaction would he have? He was looking forward to it, so he went home late at night after the red carpet and the cocktail party. When Yuan and Xiangnan were both asleep, he only went to check on Xiangnan before heading to Wen Yuan's bedroom. She slept in the gloom of the one-room apartment, as it had always been, and she whispered to him that she would not wait for him to come home. How could he not feel that she was deliberately treating him coldly? He stood in the doorway of her bedroom and watched in silence for a moment, but did not go in. He was a little tired today, and he didn't want to be bored anymore. Yimubai went straight to the bathroom. In the bathroom, he threw the shirt into the laundry basket. During the time they lived together, when Yuan had been the one to do the laundry, she didn't go to work, and she didn't like to let the servants touch her clothes. Furthermore, the servant didn't live with them. She was temporarily living in a house across the street. This was Wen Yuan's idea. Yimubai thought that this power was because Wen Yuan didn't want others to spy on their relationship. In other words, she wasn't used to being his wife, or she wasn't willing to be his wife. He snorted coldly in his heart. She might have been willing to be Yi Mulan's wife. She would have been happy being his wife, and it would have been a happy breakup. The more he thought about it, the more dissatisfied he became. He casually took off his shirt and threw it into the laundry basket. Then his gaze paused on the lipstick stain on his white shirt. After a while, he moved his gaze away, snorted coldly, and went to take a shower. In the shower he was visibly distracted. wondering what she would think when she saw his shirt. With that in mind, he showered for about 10 minutes before wiping his body with a towel. After walking out, she wrapped a towel around her waist and wiped her hair with one hand before walking back to her bedroom. He lay down, unable to fall asleep. He was always guessing what she was thinking. In the end, he simply covered his eyes with a pillow and tried not to think or look. Eventually he fell asleep. He had something to do, so he left early in the morning, but he would come back at night. He wanted to see Wen Yuan's reaction. When Wen Yuan woke up early in the morning, it was already past 7. Library of Literature. Chapter 3773. But he didn't. Instead, he went home with a lip print. Was it because he didn't care? Or was he trying to pry? But no matter which one it was, she admitted that she was disgusted. Did he want her to argue with him? Or did he tacitly approve of his relationship with Lin Danny? That night he said there was nothing. Was that how he said there was nothing? When Yuan looked at the shirt in her hands. A moment later, she threw the shirt into the trash can. Her face was a little dazed. Afterwards, she went about her business as if nothing had happened. As if nothing had happened. But she felt very cold. This marriage was so cold, just like the coming winter. That night, Yi Mubai came home very late as usual. The first thing he did was to go to the laundry room. He also saw the shirt she had thrown into the trash can. He thought she always cares about it, and she always feels uncomfortable. He waited for her to ask. However, he still did not receive a response from her the next day. They had breakfast together. She was indifferent and gentle. Of course, the indifference was directed at him, and the gentleness was directed at Xiangnan. Yi Mubai pursed his thin lips. There was a newspaper in his hand. It was a scandal between him and Lin Danny. He didn't want Xiangnan to see it, so he quietly closed the newspaper and said to Xiangnan, "Daddy is going out. Be good at home and listen to mommy, okay?" Xiangnan was especially obedient and nodded vigorously. At this moment, Yi Mubai calmly and naturally looked at Wen Yuan. Wen Yuan's head was lowered, so he couldn't see her expression. So he reached out to the table and said, "I'm leaving." She looked up and said yes. There would be no future. Yi Mubai left with a feeling of parting on bad terms. He was not a fool. He could feel her deliberate indifference. For the rest of the day, he thought about the meaning of their marriage. For the first time, he felt that he might have been wrong. He and Wen Yuan were not suitable for marriage. Her personality, her past, and even her marriage to his older brother. He thought about all kinds of things, and couldn't help feeling a little heavy when he returned home at night. After taking a shower, he went straight to her bedroom. After pausing at the door for a moment, he walked directly to the bed, sat down, and reached out to touch her cheek. "Wen Yuan, let's talk." She slowly opened her eyes. Her gaze was clear, letting him know that she hadn't slept. And in B.S. Literature Center. Chapter 3774. Also, she tried to calm herself down. A man who cheats is like money stained with shit. It's disgusting to pick it up. After she finished speaking, she looked at him calmly and got off the bed. "If you want to sleep here, I'll sleep in the guest room." She walked straight out, so fast that he couldn't catch her. When he wanted to find her, Wen Yuan had already entered the guest room and locked the door. Yi Mubai knocked on the door. "Wen Yuan, come out, let's talk." He tried to reason with her, but no woman was willing to reason with a man who had lipstick marks from another woman. Wen Yuan ignored him, but after a while, he heard a low cry outside. She was crying. Yi Mubai listened outside, and he couldn't describe the feeling in his heart. He had started to doubt his marriage, and he felt that they were not suitable for each other. But he felt annoyed when she cried. She didn't want to talk about it, and he was tired after a busy day. This matter was delayed, and no one mentioned it again. However, this matter was like burying a thread, causing their marriage to be in danger from all sides. When Yuan didn't mention it again, and neither did he, Lin Danny was still living in their world, or rather, in Yi Mubai's world. When Yuan didn't care, so Yi Mubai believed that she really didn't love him anymore. Even the basic feelings were gone. She only treated him as a fertility machine. He was a little annoyed. and he became more and more distant from her. Except for Xiangnan, there was almost no communication between them, but the atmosphere at home was still gentle. Only the two adults could understand the deliberate gentleness, and Xiangnan was too young to understand it. Her period came, and when it was time for her to be pregnant, Yi Mubai appeared in her bedroom. It had been 10 days since the last time they did it. She lay there quietly, letting him do it, but she didn't make a sound, and she didn't give him any reaction. She clenched her fists, bit her teeth, and endured. He hadn't done it for a few days, and he was a little rough. She wondered if feelings weren't important for a man, and just a look was enough. Because of her resistance, she was unable to fully immerse herself in it. It was obvious that she was just faking it. It was obvious that she was just using him as a reproductive tool. Yi Mubai becomes fierce and doesn't care about her feelings. When Yuan can't stand it anymore, she pushes against his shoulder, and Yi Mubai whispers in her ear, "You don't want children anymore, huh? To you, am I not your reproductive tool?" He didn't let her go. In the end, he made her cry. Her voice was intermittent. "Once will be enough." His thin lips moved to her ears, and his voice was hoarse. "If I don't do more, how can I make you pregnant? Don't you just want to get pregnant?" When Yuan seemed to be in a daze, then she stopped resisting and let him do whatever he wanted. Later, she fainted and fell asleep. Yi Mubai stared into her eyes and ended hastily. The days were still very simple. He went back to the United States for 2 days, then rushed back to do it with her. During the 6 to 7 days of her pregnancy, he almost didn't fall behind. However, when Yuan was still not pregnant, next month, her period arrived on time again. When Yuan looked at the smear of red, she was a little dazed and disappointed. She didn't get pregnant again. She remembered that time when she and Yi Mubai didn't use protection, and she got pregnant with Xiangnan in one night. In the past 2 months, she had done it countless times. Why didn't she get pregnant? Just as she was in a daze, the door of the washroom opened unexpectedly. It was Yi Mubai who appeared at the door. He saw it too. His pupils were a little deep. Then, he slowly closed the door, and his tall and slender body leaned against the side of the washroom door. When Yuan looked down, "Can you go out? Let's talk." Yi Mubai looked at her quietly. He didn't avoid lighting a cigarette in front of her. When Yuan pursed her lips, "Wait for me outside. We'll talk in the study later. Right here," he said a little forcefully. "It won't take long." When Yuan looked down, "Go ahead. Your period is over. Let's go to the hospital for a checkup." When Yuan, "I don't want my son to have a transplant. Do you understand what I mean? Now is not the time to be willful." His tone was a little strict. When Yuan blinked and then smiled lightly. "Willful? What right did she have to be willful? He said he wanted to have a child. She tolerated him flirting with other women. Was this willful?" She didn't know what Lin Danny's behavior was like when he knew he had a wife. Perhaps he had double standards in his heart. That was why he was different. When Yuan felt a little cold in her heart. However, she said calmly, "Okay, I'll cooperate. Can you go out now? I remember now. You don't want to be a spectator," she said lightly. Of course, Yi Mubai wouldn't be a spectator. He leaned forward and got up. Then, he opened the door and went out. When Yuan was in a daze, she only got up after a long time. The blood loss had made her a little dizzy. She tried her best to hold it in, but in the end she still fainted in the bathroom. With a loud bang, Yi Mubai frowned and immediately pulled the door open. 5 more chapters tomorrow. This book came from Chapter 3775. The moment he opened the door, he saw that Wen Yuan had fainted in the bathroom. Yi Mubai immediately went forward to carry Wen Yuan and rushed out. Then he thought of Xiangnan. In the living room, he placed Wen Yuan on the sofa and went next door to call the helper to look after Xiangnan. He then carried Wen Yuan downstairs and put her in the car. She fainted. He thought that apart from the physical discomfort, it was mostly due to the mental pressure. He frowned. Did he give her a lot of pressure? Yi Mubai started the car, his gaze cold in the night. There was a traffic jam on the way. When they were almost at the hospital, he opened the door and got out of the car, carrying her to the hospital in front. After running for 10 minutes, he sent her to the emergency room. The receptionist was an experienced gynecologist. After the examination, she looked at Yimubai. Does she have any other illnesses? Yimubai hesitated. Probably not. Probably. The gynecologist had always been the most difficult to deal with. At this moment, she looked at him with a surprised expression. Then she asked, "You are husband and wife, right? Why don't you know this basic thing?" Yimubai's expression was a little unnatural. The doctor looked at him a few more times, and then lowered her head to write. "Menstrual shock, it's nothing serious. She will be fine after resting. Oh, and don't be too stressed, otherwise, it won't be very comfortable. As a husband, you have to be considerate of your wife." Yimubai reached out to take it. He was about to leave, but he paused and coughed lightly. I want to ask. We want to have a child, but we haven't been pregnant for 2 months. Maybe she is a little stressed." The doctor looked at him in disbelief. Not getting pregnant for 2 months is already too stressed. If you don't let her get pregnant for 2 years, how can she live? Yimubai paused. "We have to get pregnant next month." He calmly told her about Xiangnan's illness. The doctor's expression changed. Then, she thought for a moment and said, "Pay attention to the frequency. It's not easy to get pregnant if you have sex too often." She wrote out a prescription. "Take this Chinese medicine back, and make it for her. Although it's not effective, it can still increase the chances of getting pregnant if both of you are fine." Yimubai took the prescription to the pharmacy. When he went to the emergency room, Wen Yuan was already awake. She was sitting on the small bed in the emergency room, her hair down. Her face was still a little pale, but it was much better than before. Seeing Yimubai come in, her voice was hoarse. "What happened to me?" He carried the medicine bag and walked to her side. He reached out his hand and placed it on top of her head, as if he wanted to stroke her hair. However, after his hand stayed there for a long time, he hesitated. "You," he said. He. And Xiangnan. "Yi," he said. When at? "I asked Auntie to take care of him," Yimubai said softly. "Oh," Wen Yuan replied and sat up. Although she was still a little dizzy, she still wanted to go home immediately. Yimubai looked at her pretending to be fine. He stuffed the bag in his hand into her arms. "I'll carry you." Yimubai looked at her pretending to be fine, and stuffed the bag in his hand into her arms. "I'll hold you." Wen Yuan bit her lip and shook her head. "I can walk." Book from Chapter 3776. However, he had already carried her up, and was walking straight to the door. It was only when he was out of the door that he remembered something. He picked up his phone, and dialed his assistant's number to get him to deal with his car, that was parked on the road, while he took a taxi to take Wen Yuan home. Of course, the taxi wasn't as comfortable as his car, and Wen Yuan was weak, so she was forced to lean on his shoulder. His shoulders were wide and suitable for Asian women to lean on. Wen Yuan's cheek rested on his shoulder, and she could see the side of his face, and his sexy Adam's apple from where she was. She pursed her lips and looked at him silently. In the past, this was a distant dream of hers. But now to her it was within reach, yet it was even further away. She lowered her eyes, not wanting to look at him anymore. Sometimes, it would make her sad if she looked too much. They were in a marriage, yet they were as strangers as they were in the past. As for him, he held on to her shoulder, and kept looking in the direction in front. Then his phone rang. It was especially abrupt in such a quiet space. Yimubai was still holding on to her, as he picked up his phone with the other hand. It was a call from Lin Danny. He froze for a moment, and wanted to hang up. At this moment Wen Yuan said faintly, "Answer the phone." With that said, she broke free from his embrace, and leaned against the other side, before looking out of the car. Yimubai glanced at her before hanging up. But then, there was dead silence in the car. Instead, the driver in the front laughed. "Young lady, you can't be so generous. Men nowadays are all fickle, especially when your husband is so handsome. It's not wrong to keep a close eye on him. How can you push him to someone else? This won't do. You must be from outside, right? The women in H City are very good at dealing with their husbands. They are very resourceful. You have to learn from them." Wen Yuan bit her phone and forced out a smile uncomfortably. Yi Mubai looked at her and said nothing. Later, when they reached the apartment, she didn't talk about Lin Danny either. Yi Mubai carried her to the bedroom, and she wanted to get up. He reached out to hold her and said in a displeased tone, "How much longer are you going to be willful? I'm going to boil the medicine." Her expression was a little strange as she paused for a moment. "I want to go to the bathroom to change. I've had too much for the first 2 days." Only then did he understand. He stared at her for a long time, his eyes burning with passion. Wen Yuan suspected that he was a pervert. Earlier, when she was in the bathroom, he had been lazing around. Now that she said she was going to change, he was looking at her with such a gaze. Did he like to see red? Or did he like to have his private parts broken? Her mind was in a mess as she slowly got out of bed and walked to the bathroom. When she came out, her face was pale because she had lost too much blood. When she opened the door, she saw Yi Mubai standing at the door with one hand in his pocket. He said indifferently, "I asked the auntie to make you a tonic. I'll ask her to bring it to you later." Wen Yuan didn't say anything and just slowly returned to his bedroom. He wanted to follow, but he soon saw Xiangnan. He frowned and brought the little fellow to the living room outside, letting him sit and play. Yi Mubai squatted down and said in a hoarse voice, "Let mommy rest, okay?" Xiangnan looked at him thoughtfully. "What's wrong with mommy?" Yi Mubai reached out and rubbed Xiangnan's little head. He said softly, "Mommy is just tired. Let her rest, okay?" He wanted to leave and return Lin Danny's call. However, Xiangnan reached out and tugged at his hand, saying softly, "Daddy." Book from Chapter 3777. He turned around and looked at Xiangnan. Xiangnan's little face had a faint blush. He didn't know if it was because of shyness. He asked softly, "Daddy, will you be with another auntie?" Yi Mubai's expression froze. Then, he turned around and looked in the direction of Wen Yuan's bedroom. He asked softly, "Did mommy tell you that?" Xiangnan shook his head. "No, I saw it on TV." Yi Mubai sighed in his heart. He leaned over and pressed his forehead against Xiangnan's. He said hoarsely, "No, Daddy won't leave Xiangnan." Xiangnan pressed against him. Such a young child wasn't easy to fool. After a long time, such a long time of warmth, Xiangnan finally broke free and said softly but firmly, "Daddy, if one day you get together with other aunties, I want to be with mommy. The baby in mommy's tummy is the same." Yi Mubai was a little surprised. He looked at Xiangnan and didn't say anything for a long time. He wanted Xiangnan to speak again, but the little guy didn't want to say anything anymore. Yi Mubai reached out and patted his head. Then he went to the study. He was smoking in the study with his phone in his hand. He had wanted to call Lin Danny, but he hesitated. His relationship with Lin Danny was just like how it was on the surface. She was just like the countless women who admired him, just like Wen Yuan in the past. The only difference was that he had only slept with Wen Yuan. Of course, Wen Yuan wasn't the only woman he had. But he had never touched Lin Danny. He didn't push her out of his life. Just as Wen Yuan had said, Lin Danny's personality was very similar to Lin Cece's. They looked alike too. He slowly puffed out smoke rings. Finally, he dialed Lin Danny's number. She drank too much and seemed to be crying. She kept talking and crying, saying that he didn't want to accompany her. Yi Mubai listened quietly. He didn't hate Lin Danny. When a man couldn't get the woman he wanted, the substitute would become cute. Moreover, he didn't need to be careful with her. This was probably the deep-rooted bad habit of many men. After a long time, Yi Mubai said, "Danny, you should have grown up." Actually, he knew that she had gone to look for Wen Yuan. She had done all sorts of things on purpose, but he had indulged her. Other than testing Wen Yuan, he had also indulged Lin Danny a little. Otherwise, how could a girl be so arrogant? Lin Danny was not a fool. She knew it very well. That was why their ambiguity had fermented into what it was today. But she was not satisfied. She wanted him. She wanted all of him. She drank a little too much, and her words were murmuring to herself. "Mubai, I miss you very much. Can you come and accompany me?" Yi Mubai looked down. "Drink less." With that, he hung up the phone. He would not let a young girl control him. He treated her as a substitute for Lin Cece. He spoiled her a little, but not to that extent. After hanging up, he smoked a few more cigarettes and walked out. It just so happened to be mealtime. When he went out, Xiangnan was sitting upright in his chair. Yi Mubai went over and sat down. He looked at Xiangnan. "Where's Mummy?" Xiangnan lowered his head and said in a low voice, "Mummy is still sleeping. She said she doesn't want to eat." Yi Mubai looked up and asked the auntie at home, "Did Madam eat the supplements that were brought over just now?" Chapter 3778. She heard him on the phone. However, the housekeeper still answered seriously. "It's like this. Madam seemed to want to talk to the second young master after dinner. When she came to the study, she saw that the second young master was on the phone, so she didn't disturb him. Then, she went to bed and said that she wouldn't be eating." Yi Mubai's expression immediately changed. "She went to the study?" The housekeeper nodded. "Yes. Madam stood at the door for a while and left." At this moment, the housekeeper felt a little uneasy. She said softly, "Sir, did Madam hear something?" Yi Mubai glanced at her. She immediately understood that she had crossed the line and didn't dare to speak again. Yi Mubai took care of Xiangnan's meal and then stayed with him for a while. However, the little Xiangnan noticed that he was absent-minded. He played with the building blocks and said softly, "Daddy, if you want to see Mommy, you can go. I'm fine by myself." Yi Mubai coughed lightly. "How did you know?" "Because you looked at the time 5 times just now," Xiangnan said. Yi Mubai thought about what he had said before. He thought that this child was actually very similar to himself. From the looks of it, Xiangnan was reflected in him, and he was reflected in Wen Yuan. He thought about it in his heart. There was an indescribable feeling in his heart, but he still got up and patted his son's head. "I'll go see Mommy." Yi Mubai originally thought that Xiangnan didn't care too much about a complete family. However, when he got up and was about to leave, the little person stopped him. "Daddy." He looked at the small, soft person. Xiangnan's little face had a touch of shyness, and his voice was also very soft. "Daddy, I want you to be with Mommy." Yi Mubai looked at Xiangnan and suddenly felt that he was a little cruel to this child. He wanted to maintain his marriage with Wen Yuan, but at the same time, he didn't completely reject Lin Danny. He actually made a mistake that many men in the world would make. Apart from not sleeping with her, he did everything else. Of course, it wasn't like he didn't have women when he was in America. Yi Mubai's mood was a little complicated. He needed to think about it. He went to Wen Yuan's bedroom. Wen Yuan was lying on her side, her body slightly moving up and down. He knew that she was not asleep, so he walked over and sat on the bed behind her. He paused for a moment and reached out to touch her back. "Get up and eat before you sleep." She didn't say anything, so he patted her again. "Wen Yuan, I know you're awake. Let's talk." She said, "Talk about what? Is it Lin Danny?" Her voice was a little tired. "I won't stop you. I don't care if you want to mess around with her in marriage or divorce and give her a title. Just don't let Xiangnan come into contact with these things too early, okay? Yi Mubai, I beg you to be a father with warmth." There was a hint of anger in Yi Mubai's voice. "In your eyes, am I such a man?" Wen Yuan didn't respond. She just sat up slowly. Her face was pale. She reached out and wrapped her blanket around herself, as if that would give her a sense of security. After a long time, she raised her eyes and looked at him. Her lips moved. "Isn't that what you did?" His eyes narrowed dangerously. "Wen Yuan, nothing happened between me and Lin Danny." He said this because he really didn't have sex. Maybe they had kissed a few times, and they almost had sex. But in the end, he stopped because it was after marriage, and he didn't want to be too much of a jerk. End of this chapter. Chapter 3779. Chapter 3779. Warshi heard him on the phone. If one day he wanted to be with Lin Danny, he would cut off all ties with Wen Yuan. However, he didn't expect that just as he told Wen Yuan that it was nothing, Lin Danny, who was on the other end of the line, got drunk. Because he had hung up and turned off his phone, her imagination ran wild. She wasn't willing to give up, and released a video to the media. It was the passionate kiss between her and Yi Mu-bai in the elevator. As Yi Mu-bai was speaking, his phone rang. It was his assistant calling. His tone was very urgent. Director Yi, the situation now is very tricky. The thing that Miss Lin Danny released. I'll send it to you. Yi Mu-bai frowned and immediately walked out. Standing in the hallway, he lowered his head and received the message. It wasn't edited. It really existed. He knew it. After watching quietly for a while, he left the room and dialed his assistant's number. No matter how much it costs, deal with it. He didn't want Wen Yuan to see it. The assistant hesitated for a moment and asked, Director Yi, are you sure? Yes. His voice was indifferent. Go do it. After saying that, he wanted to walk back to the bedroom, but Wen Yuan stood at the door with a calm gaze. But inside, there was clearly disillusionment. She looked at him calmly. After a long time, she smiled faintly and retreated. Closed the door. Yi Mu-bai looked at her, his gaze slightly tense. He knew that she had seen it. Her gaze was full of mockery, as if she was saying that nothing had happened just a second ago. And in the next second, such a thing had happened. Just like the lipstick mark incident that night, when Yuan dealt with it coldly. She didn't make a scene with him. She just didn't want to bother with him. He opened the door and went in. She didn't lock the door, probably because she didn't want to affect Xiang Nan. He walked in quietly and stood by the bed. He thought for a moment and said, I only kissed her. Nothing else. When Yuan lay with his back to him, after a long time he asked, Are you explaining, or are you giving me a guarantee? In fact, Yi Mu-bai doesn't need it. You just need to protect Xiangnan. He's too young and his heart is too fragile. I don't want him to know these things. As for the rest, you can do as you wish. The look in his eyes became dangerous, and his voice was tense. Then you don't care, do you? Wen Yuan chuckled bitterly and self-deprecatingly. What's the point of me caring? Yi Mu-bai, haven't you ever thought of divorcing me and being with Lin Danny? She slowly sat up and looked at him under the crystal light. Are you sure you didn't? Yi Mu-bai could not deny it. The atmosphere was tense. Yi Mu-bai, really, you don't have to worry about it. To me, this isn't a betrayal. He stared at her. And at this moment, he realized that this woman's heart was as still as water. Yi Mu-bai didn't explain anymore. He didn't tell her that when everything happened, he instinctively chose to keep their marriage. Unfortunately, in Wen Yuan's heart, their marriage never existed. Her feelings for him had completely disappeared when he came home with Lin Danny's lipstick mark. They were just strangers living in the same house. They just had a common son. They just needed to have another son. It was just like that, nothing more. Yi Mu-bai also smiled sadly. Yes, you're actually quite right. She looked up, and her face was full of brilliance. It actually hurt his eyes. End of this chapter. Chapter 3780. Translator, King Bao Editor. Dark Gem. He left and returned to the study. His phone rang again. This time, it was Lin Danny. His phone rang again. This time, it was Lin Danny's call. Yi Mu-bai hesitated for a moment, but he still picked it up. When he picked up the phone, the voice on the other end was weak. Mu-bai, are you angry at me? Do you not want to talk to me anymore? He could tell that something was wrong. His voice was tense. Where are you? Lin Danny chuckled. In the hotel bathroom. The water is very red. Mu-bai, my whole body is relaxed now. I feel very comfortable, and I'm enjoying it. Yi Mu-bai held his phone and walked out. He started the car while talking to her. As he drove, he saw Wen Yuan on the balcony in the rearview mirror. Under the night sky, her hair was let down, and she was only wearing a thin nightgown. She stood there and looked at him, just like how she had seen him and Lin Danny hugging that night. He clenched his fists. For a moment he wanted to stop. He wanted to ignore Lin Danny's life, and go back to tell Wen Yuan that no matter what happened to this marriage, they could continue living like this. There was nothing wrong with that. At least, they were quite harmonious when it came to sex. But in the end he didn't. In a sense, if he hadn't given Lin Danny that kind of hope, she wouldn't have come to this. However, when he rushed to the hotel and knocked on the door, he was greeted by the image of Lin Danny coming out of the shower and countless reporters. It was a news release that couldn't be suppressed. Are you surprised? Lin Danny hugged his neck. She had the scent of rose essence on her body. To be honest, it was very tempting. Most men wouldn't be able to resist it. Moreover, she was really a beautiful girl with a good family background. Which man could resist her throwing herself at him? However, she had met Yi Mubai, the Yi Mubai who was used to seeing women. At this moment, facing such an extreme temptation, he was reminded of Wen Yuan's beauty on the balcony. He regretted it instead. He reached out, wanting to push Lin Danny away, but she hugged him like an octopus. She murmured, "Mubai, don't you want to get rid of her? You can make her back off now, and let her know that you love me." Yi Mubai's expression was a little ugly. After a long time, he pushed Lin Danny away and said in a very low voice, "I don't love you. I'm sorry." He looked at her with a complicated gaze, and also a little disappointed. He still walked back resolutely. The reporters were desperately taking pictures of the romantic affairs of the former best actor and the current night director. His target was still Lin Danny. Everything that had happened before was just groundless accusations. The few things that happened today were the real deal. Firstly, it was the kissing gate. Secondly, it was the truth. Director Yi came over in the middle of the night. However, it was obvious that he didn't like Lin Danny's actions and wanted to leave on bad terms. At this time, there was no way to do public relations. Yi Mubai left immediately. Lin Danny laughed coldly. Then she said softly behind him, "Yi Mubai, you've fallen in love with her, haven't you?" Her voice became louder. "Are you crazy? She's your ex-sister-in-law. Are you going to be together with your big brother's woman?" Yi Mubai was stunned. He clenched his fists. He had always thought that the willful Wen Yuan was the limit of his tolerance. However, there was still a woman who exceeded his expectations today. He had even liked this girl a lot. He liked her willfulness and her looks. However, at this moment she was very vicious. Chapter 3781. He turned his head and looked at Lin Danny. Lin Danny's face was filled with madness, completely different from the sweetness from before. She had a cold smile on her face. "We can't go back, right? So you want to destroy it, right?" he asked calmly. She said yes and laughed so hard that her body was shaking. She didn't care about the gazes and cameras of the reporters. She danced barefoot ballet in the corridor, saying that her ballet was his favorite in the past. Yi Mubai watched calmly as she went crazy. In the end, he still left. Before he left, he looked at the reporters. "My wife's name is Wen Yuan. If anyone writes a word of it, I'll make his company disappear tomorrow." Wen Yuan. Everyone was silent because that was Chief Ye's wife, Yi Mubai's ex-sister-in-law. Lin Danny was actually telling the truth. With that, Yi Mubai left. Lin Danny pounced over and hugged his waist from behind, sobbing softly. "Mubai, it's my fault. I drank too much. Can you forgive me?" He pulled her out from behind and pressed his hands on her shoulders. After a long time he said calmly, "Lin Danny, I won't see you alone in the future." Perhaps something had really happened between them, but he couldn't seem to stand strong emotions. He didn't like women clinging to him, be it Wen Yuan in the past or Lin Danny now. Yi Mubai left without any reluctance. Lin Danny stood in the corridor and said hoarsely, "Yi Mubai, I really love you." He didn't stay for a second and left directly. Yi Mubai sat in the car, feeling a little annoyed. He knew that no one dared to write about Wen Yuan, but there were many ways for it to spread. Besides, he couldn't wash away the matter between him and Lin Danny. But it wasn't clean either. He smoked a few cigarettes before starting the car. He had just returned to the condominium, and before he got out of the car, Yi Mulan called. He scolded him. Yi Mubai listened lazily. The relationship between the two brothers was very good. Of course, they wouldn't fight because of this. However, he still had to listen to Yi Mulan for some things because his legs were thick. After hanging up the phone, he saw that he had been bombarded for half an hour. He didn't really care, but when he was about to return to his apartment, his heart was still heavy. He had never thought of being a loving couple with Wen Yuan, but when Lin Danny made a big fuss as a husband, he felt very sorry for Wen Yuan. After all, Wen Yuan was a very low-key person, and their previous identities were very special. He got out of the car, closed the door, and walked up the stairs. It was late at night. He opened the door. It was dark everywhere. Only Wen Yuan's bedroom was lit. He stood in the doorway, his tall frame elongated in the light. Wen Yuan sat on the bed and looked up at him. He stared back at her. But at that moment, neither of them knew what to say. After a long time, he said in a hoarse voice, "It's completely over." "Do you think so?" Wen Yuan lowered his eyes. "You probably don't know how crazy a person can be when they are infatuated with someone." Yi Mubai still stood there and looked at her quietly. After a long time, he said in a low voice, "What about you, Wen Yuan? Is your infatuation still there?" She smiled faintly and lowered her eyes. "Probably not anymore." At that moment, he saw disillusionment in her eyes again. Chapter 3782. She heard him on the phone. He stood there for a long time. Wen Yuan said softly, "Go and see Xiangnan. It wouldn't be peaceful for the next few days." She didn't feel wronged, but she felt that it was unfair to Xiangnan. Yi Mubai looked at her for a long time before leaving. He went to see Xiangnan. The little guy was sleeping soundly and looked carefree. Yi Mubai suddenly felt like a loving father. He thought that no matter what happened between him and Wen Yuan, he should treat this child well. Moreover, after he and Wen Yuan got married, his relationship with Lin Danny was like revenge against Wen Yuan. In the end, it wasn't Wen Yuan who was hurt, but himself. Because he realized that the person he cared about the most was himself. Yi Mubai closed his eyes, let out a long sigh, and walked out slowly. That night, he didn't sleep at all. He thought a lot. Later, he understood some things. Early in the morning, what happened last night was like a butterfly effect. Because of Yi Mulin, Lin Danny's family didn't dare to say anything. But Lin Danny was admitted to the hospital. Because of suicide. Wrist slit. It was an uproar. Wen Yuan's apartment was surrounded, and it was almost impossible to move. Xiangnan couldn't even go to the hospital. Yi Mubai made a decision to return to B City. Wen Yuan was against it. She stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling window in the study and said calmly, "I don't want to go back to B City." Yi Mubai was a little annoyed. Otherwise, he wouldn't have smoked in front of her. His voice was a little indifferent. "Look at the reporters below. Do you think you can live here peacefully? What about B City? Do you think you can?" Wen Yuan turned around. He looked at her and said in a low voice, "Come to America with me, Wen Yuan. No one knows you there." What he didn't say was that he didn't want others to criticize her and say that she was. Also, he didn't want her to face his family. Wen Yuan looked down and didn't say anything else. Therefore, the trip to the United States was put on the agenda, and they would leave in about a week. Yi Mubai contacted a doctor in the US for Xiangnan, and the medical records here were also sent over. After everything was prepared, they would leave H City a week later. They would stay in B City for 2 days before going to the US. Wen Yuan also began to pack her luggage. She was a little worried when she was packing. She had thought that she would settle down in H City for a long time, and that she would not go to America with him. However, they still had to go together. As for what happened between him and Lin Danny, she didn't ask about it. It was probably not going to end well. Wen Yuan's mind wandered for a long time, before he continued packing up the things in his hands. Yi Mubai walked into the changing room and looked at her. His voice was a little faint. "What are you thinking about?" "No, it's just that. I feel like I've only lived here for a month or two." It was rare for her to have such a long conversation with him these days. "I quite like H City." He squatted down and looked at her. "What you don't like is someone or something, right?" "Not really." She smiled indifferently. "Actually, regarding Xiangnan's matter, I have a favor to ask of you. I'm not that unreasonable." She wanted to continue packing, but he reached out and grabbed her. His voice was extremely hoarse. "Wen Yuan, I admit that I was ridiculous for a while after I lost my memory." She pulled her hand away. "What do you mean by saying all this?" He frowned. "What I mean is that we can be an ordinary couple, just like everyone else." End of this chapter. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference. as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.